Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I found out about the mansion on a Tuesday morning. I got a phone call from a lawyer who said I was the only living heir to some distant relative I'd never met. I didn't ask many questions because I was curious about the idea of having a house in the countryside. I drove out there the next day in my old sedan. It took 3 hours to get there, mostly on winding roads. There weren't many cars around. I felt a little uneasy. I saw thick trees on both sides of the road, and the sun was still high enough to give everything a pale, weak light. When I pulled up, I stopped the car in front of a long driveway with rusted gates. I parked and walked up the driveway. The gate creaked when I pushed it open. The house was big, with tall windows boarded up and vines covering the walls. The front steps looked cracked. The porch had some scattered leaves and dirt. The main door was heavy. I had a set of keys from the lawyer's office, but the lock was stiff. I wiggled the key around until the door clicked. It swung inward, and a stale smell hit me right away. It smelled like dust, old wood, and damp air. I held my breath, stepped in, and flipped a light switch. Nothing worked. The power was probably off for years. I used a flashlight I'd brought. The hallway was wide with a high ceiling. I saw old paintings on the walls. Most of them were crooked or covered in a layer of grime. The floor was wooden and creaked under my boots. I looked around. There was a wide staircase ahead, leading to the second floor. Doors lined the hallway on both sides. I checked the first door on the right. It led to a living room with large windows facing the front yard. The curtains were thick and dusty. Furniture was covered in white sheets. The air felt heavy. I decided to explore more before I settled in for the night. I wasn't sure where I'd sleep yet. I found a kitchen in the back. It had old appliances and a big cast iron stove. Everything looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. A door led to a pantry filled with cobwebs. Another door opened onto a backyard with an overgrown garden. I didn't see anything too strange at first. It was just an old abandoned place. I went upstairs next. The second floor had a hallway with doors on each side. Most of the bedrooms were empty or full of dusty furniture. One bedroom had a broken bed frame and a closet with a missing door. Another bedroom had a small dresser with broken handles. I kept looking around, trying to figure out if there was anything worth keeping. At the end of the hallway, I noticed a narrow door I almost missed. It didn't match the rest of the doors because it was plain and unadorned. It was locked, but the keys I had seemed to fit it. I turned the key and the lock clicked. This door led to a narrow staircase going downward. I thought it was a second set of stairs, maybe for servants. I went down carefully because it was dark. My flashlight beam shook on the walls. The steps were steep and the air got colder. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a kind of hidden corridor. The walls were lined with old wallpaper peeling away. I saw a faint light coming from under a door at the end of the hall. I walked slowly toward it, feeling a chill in my arms and shoulders. That door opened onto a large room. It was a rectangular hall with a high ceiling. I spotted a chandelier above, covered in dust. There were no windows, but a single skylight near the top let in some late afternoon light. In the center of the room, something big was attached to the wall with chains. I stepped closer and realized it was a tall mirror. The glass was foggy and stained. The frame was dark wood, carved with strange shapes. Thick metal chains held it against the wall, and there was a padlock at the bottom. I walked around it, shined my flashlight on it, and tried to see my reflection. The glass was so clouded that I could only see a blurred outline of myself. I felt uneasy. I couldn't say why, but the air in that room felt heavier than anywhere else in the house. I noticed the door behind me swing a bit and then shut on its own. I jumped at the sound of the latch clicking. I walked back to check the door, but it was unlocked, so I pushed it open again and propped it with a small chunk of wood I found on the ground. I took one more look at the mirror. My reflection seemed warped, like there was something behind me in the glass. I moved my flashlight around, trying to see if there was a shape or a stain. I couldn't make it out clearly. After a few minutes, I left that hall, went upstairs, and decided to pick a bedroom on the second floor to sleep in for the night. I picked the cleanest bedroom I could find. I threw an old blanket on the floor, and I used my jacket as a pillow. I couldn't rest well. The house creaked all night. I heard strange tapping from below. Sometimes I thought I heard a voice, but it might have been the wind. Eventually, I dozed off. When I woke up, it was morning, and I could see light through the cracks in the boarded windows. I felt stiff. My back hurt. I got up and tried to find a bathroom with running water. There was a small one at the end of the hallway, but the taps only gave a trickle of rusty water. I splashed some on my face, tasted iron on my lips, and spat it out. I decided to check out the rest of the mansion during the day. I was curious about that hidden hall and the mirror. I went back down, made my way to that narrow door, and walked into the corridor again. Sunlight was coming through the skylight in the hidden room. The mirror looked the same, except the dust on the glass seemed disturbed. I could see a partial reflection of myself, but the shape still looked off. I stood there about 4 feet from the mirror. I shifted to the left and right, watching my reflection. I noticed a dark outline behind my shoulder in the reflection. It wasn't just my shadow because it looked taller and bulkier. I felt my pulse jump. I turned around, but I saw nothing behind me. I heard a clicking sound from somewhere in the house. It echoed off the walls. The corridor door slammed shut again, and I felt a rush of cool air. I checked the door, saw that same chunk of wood I had used was now kicked to the side. I felt frustrated. I picked it up and jammed it harder against the door. Then I went back to the mirror. I touched the glass. It was cold. I slid my fingers across the surface and tried to wipe away some dust. My hand shook a bit, and I had no reason to be so jumpy, but I felt like I was being watched. The entire time I stood there, I felt tension in my neck and shoulders, like I was waiting for something to happen. I stayed in that house for a few days because I wanted to figure out how I could fix it up, or at least see if it was worth anything. During those days, I started noticing small things. The bedroom door I slept behind would lock on its own. I'd set it to stay open, then find it stuck. Sometimes I heard quiet footsteps in the hallway at night. I would get up, open the door, and see nothing. The power was off, so I used flashlights and candles after sundown. The flickering candlelight always made me see movements in the corners of my vision. I'd turn my head, but nothing was there. On the third night, I decided to examine the mirror again. I felt drawn to that room. I walked into the corridor around midnight. The house was silent except for occasional creaks. My flashlight was running low on batteries, so I lit a candle I brought with me. I stood in front of the mirror. The flame reflected off the glass, but the reflection looked murky. I thought I saw faint movement in the mirror, like a slow shifting in the background. My scalp tingled and I got goosebumps on my arms. My stomach felt hollow. I lifted the candle closer to the glass. I thought I heard my name, whispered from behind me, but it sounded muffled. I spun around and found nothing. I felt my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I heard a soft rasping sound like cloth dragging against the floor. It seemed to come from behind the mirror. I moved around to check, but the mirror was flush to the wall. There was no space behind it. Then I heard my name again, but this time it sounded like it was coming through the mirror itself. I took a step back, nearly dropping the candle. I tried to calm myself, but I couldn't slow my breathing. The voice was low and rough, but it was definitely saying my name. It repeated it a few times, then stopped. I backed out of the room and hurried upstairs, leaving the candle behind. The next morning, I woke up with a start. My dreams had been full of dark shapes and muffled calls. I went down to get the candle I'd left behind. The hallway was still locked. I opened the door and found the candle on the floor. The flame had died out, leaving a puddle of wax. The mirror looked the same. The glass still had that cloudy film, but now I saw more of my reflection. The silhouette behind me seemed sharper, like it had more definition. I could see a hint of shoulders and a head. but it was vague. I felt cold sweat on my forehead. I forced myself to speak just to break the silence. I said, "Hello." My voice echoed. Nothing answered. Over the next couple of days, I kept feeling watched. Even when I was in other parts of the house, I felt eyes on me. I heard occasional whispers that stopped as soon as I turned my head. I had a growing urge to look at the mirror. Sometimes I fought it, but other times I gave in. Each time I saw my reflection in that grimy glass, I saw more detail in the figure behind me. I started to make out a faint face. It was twisted, like the features were blurred. It never moved, but every time I blinked, I felt like it shifted position just a little. I tried not to stare. My hands would sweat, and my legs felt weak whenever I stood there. The house itself didn't help. Doors banged shut, hinges squeaked, and floorboards groaned at odd times. At night, I'd walk around to see if any windows were open, but everything was sealed. I heard faint tapping in the walls. I felt my breath quicken whenever it happened. I checked the fuse box, thinking maybe I should restore power, but something told me I shouldn't. I wasn't ready to be here at night with all the lights on, seeing every corner and shadow. On the fifth night, I woke up around 3 a.m. with a tightness in my chest. I heard a voice coming from downstairs. It was low and raspy. It said my name again, then repeated, "Let me out." I froze in bed. My mouth went dry. My palms were sweaty. The voice kept calling. I felt pulled to the mirror. I grabbed my flashlight and walked out of the bedroom. The hallway was dark. My footsteps echoed as I made my way to that hidden staircase. My heart thumped so hard that my chest hurt. I opened the door at the bottom of the stairs and pointed my flashlight at the mirror. The shape in the mirror wasn't just a shadow anymore. It looked like a man's figure standing behind me. I saw shoulders, arms, and the outline of a head that seemed to turn slightly. My breathing got shallow. I took a step forward. The voice said, "Let me out." I smelled a strange odor, like old, damp cloth. The reflection's lips moved in the glass. I was sure I saw that. I could barely keep my flashlight steady. I looked at the chains on the mirror. They were rusted, and there was a large padlock. The voice said, "Please." I felt an odd compulsion to touch the padlock. My mind was racing. I asked, "Who are you?" No one answered, but the silhouette in the mirror twitched. I heard metal scrape against the wood behind the mirror. My stomach churned, and a shiver ran down my spine. I forced myself to back away. I went upstairs, closed the door to my bedroom, and slid a dresser in front of it. I couldn't sleep. I sat on the floor thinking about what I'd just witnessed. My thoughts were jumbled. I worried that I was losing my mind. But I couldn't ignore what I had seen and heard. That mirror had something in it. It was trying to get out. When morning came, I put the dresser aside and left the bedroom. I thought about leaving the mansion. Maybe I would sell it as is. I decided to go back to the hidden hall one last time, just to see if I could handle it in daylight. Sunlight came through the skylight again. The figure was still there in the reflection, more visible than ever. I could see faint features like eyes and a blurred mouth. I tried not to look for too long. My nerves were shot. I took a deep breath and stepped closer. The shape in the mirror looked at me. I felt sure of it this time. Its head tilted. Then I heard my name. It wasn't just in my head. It came from the mirror, like someone standing right behind the glass. The voice said, "Set me free." I bolted upstairs. I began packing my things. I wanted to escape that house and never return. But as I was zipping up my bag, the door to my room slammed shut again. I tried the knob and it wouldn't budge. I heard the faint voice calling me from downstairs. My heart rate spiked. I yanked at the doorknob a few more times. The metal felt cold and stuck. I kicked the door and it finally swung open. In the hallway, I heard that voice again. It echoed from the hidden staircase. It said, "Come down." I ran. I grabbed my bag and headed straight for the front door. My heart pounded in my ears the whole time. I rushed outside, locking the door behind me. I almost dropped my keys as my hands shook. I ran to my car, threw my bag in the back seat, and started the engine. I looked up at the house. For a moment, I thought I saw someone in one of the upper windows. My vision blurred from adrenaline, so I can't be sure. I drove away, feeling my whole body tense. I don't know what's in that mirror or why it whispers my name. I haven't gone back. I still have the deed to the house. I don't want to sell it yet because I don't want anyone else going inside and facing that thing. I stay awake at night, thinking about that silhouette. Sometimes I think I hear its voice in my apartment, even though I'm miles away. I never expected a simple inheritance to tear at my nerves like this, but I can't ignore what happened in that house. I can't forget the sound of that voice or the sight of that chained mirror. It's all real and it's waiting, locked behind rusted chains, whispering for someone to let it out. And I'm not sure how long those chains will hold. I felt my stomach sink the moment my headlights hit that wall of fog. It looked like a solid barrier, too thick and too sudden. I wasn't expecting it at all. 1 minute, the road was just dark and lonely. The next minute, I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of the car. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, trying to figure out if there was a turnoff or somewhere safe to stop. My nerves were already tight because I was running late for a work-related stop in the mountains. The GPS had lost its signal miles ago, and my phone was useless. The map I kept in my glove compartment was worn and vague. I only had a rough idea of where I was. I crept along the road, hugging the right side, hoping not to slide off the edge. The fog kept getting denser, and I couldn't tell if it was just normal mist or something else. My hands were sweating against the steering wheel. Every time I thought I saw a shape in the distance, it disappeared. The beams of my headlights bounced back, creating a white haze that hurt my eyes. After what felt like an hour, I spotted a small wooden sign. I leaned forward to read it. It said, Hotel Morin, vacancies. The arrow pointed up a narrow driveway on the left. I was relieved to see any sign of civilization. I turned into the driveway. Gravel crunched under the tires. The car jolted over a few potholes. Through the fog, I noticed a large, old building. It had a wraparound porch with sagging beams. Dim lights glowed through a few windows. I parked near the entrance and took a moment to breathe. My heart was racing, and my mouth felt dry. I told myself it was just the stress of the drive. I grabbed my overnight bag from the back seat and stepped outside. The air was cold and damp. My breath came out in ragged puffs. There wasn't any wind, just this heavy silence. I climbed the porch stairs. The wood groaned under my feet. I tried the front door. It opened right away, no key or code. A single overhead bulb lit the foyer. The carpet looked faded, and there was an old front desk with a dusty bell. A tall grandfather clock in the corner showed an incorrect time. It said around 3 o'clock, but it was closer to 9 at night. I went to the desk and tapped the bell. Its ring sounded strange, almost muffled. Nobody came. I waited a bit, then tapped it again. I glanced around, expecting someone to step out of a back office. Eventually, an older man appeared at the top of the stairs. He moved slowly down to the lobby. He wore a plain gray suit that looked outdated. He asked me if I needed a room. I said yes. He grabbed a metal key from a board behind the desk and handed it to me without much fuss. No paperwork, no questions. He didn't even tell me the room number, he just said it was at the end of the second-floor hallway. I tried to ask about dinner or a phone, but he muttered something about the kitchen being closed and then disappeared through a door behind the desk. I didn't push it. I was exhausted, and I just wanted to sleep. I took the old staircase to the second floor. The steps felt uneven, and the banister was loose. A single wall sconce lit the hallway, throwing long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. I walked past a few closed doors, checking the numbers until I reached mine, room 209. The key fit perfectly, and I stepped inside. The room was small, with a simple bed, a dresser, and a tiny bathroom. The light switch by the door barely illuminated anything, but I saw that the sheets were clean, and there was a little closet with a single wooden hanger. It smelled musty, like old books. The window overlooked the driveway, but I couldn't see much except the swirling fog. I closed the door, locked it, and set my bag on the dresser. My head pounded from the tension of the drive. I decided to wash up and then try to sleep. The bathroom sink let out a burst of rust-colored water before it ran clear. The temperature kept shifting from hot to cold. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes looked bloodshot, and my face felt clammy. At one point, I thought I heard a thump out in the hall. I paused, water dripping from my hands, but everything went quiet again. After drying off, I turned off the light and climbed into bed. The mattress creaked, and the pillow was flat. I tried to get comfortable, but I kept thinking about the deserted front desk and the odd vibe of the place. The old man's blank stare felt off. I stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster, trying to relax. Eventually, I drifted off. I snapped awake sometime later. At first, I didn't know what had startled me. My heart was hammering against my chest. I sat up and listened. The corridor outside was dead silent. I thought maybe I'd imagined a noise. Then I heard it again, a dragging sound like footsteps scuffing along the carpet. I got out of bed and walked to the door. I pressed my ear against the wood. The sound was faint, but it was definitely footsteps. They paused, then started again. They seemed to move up and down the hallway. I flicked on the room's light and reached for the doorknob. My instincts told me to stay inside, but my curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door a crack. The hallway light was even dimmer than before. The sconce flickered and I had trouble focusing on anything. I stuck my head out and looked both ways. I couldn't see a person, but the footsteps continued. They seemed to be coming from just around the corner at the far end. I cleared my throat and asked if someone needed help. No answer. I took a slow step into the hallway. The carpet felt cold under my bare feet. The sound changed direction, like it was moving away from me. My nerves were on edge, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears. I walked toward the corner, one careful step at a time. The corridor felt longer than it had when I first walked to my room. I passed 3 doors that I didn't remember seeing before. I paused and looked back, but room 209 seemed farther away. It was still there, but it looked like the hallway had stretched. I told myself I was just tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But my hands started to tremble. The footsteps stopped again, then started behind me. I spun around, but I saw nobody. I caught a whiff of something stale, like wet stone or old basement walls. I decided to return to my room. I walked back, trying to ignore the goosebumps on my arms. When I reached my door, I hesitated. Something felt off about the doorknob. It was the same knob, same scratched brass, but my key wouldn't fit. I tried twisting it, pushing it, but it didn't budge. I stood there, pressing my forehead against the wood, swallowing my panic. My throat was dry and my mouth tasted like copper. I told myself to stay calm, that there had to be a mistake. I knocked on the door. No answer. I tried again, louder. Nothing. I heard another noise behind me. It sounded like a soft whisper. I could swear it said my name. I can't explain how I recognized it. It just felt like someone knew me. I turned, and the corridor was empty, but I felt a draft. The sconce flickered again, and I saw the fog inside the hallway now. A thin layer of gray mist was creeping along the floor, drifting in through the cracks near the windows, or under the doors. It made me shiver. I rubbed my arms and started backing away. I needed to find the stairs. I decided I'd go down to the lobby and wait until morning if I had to. I walked in the direction of the stairs, but the corridor kept going. The pattern in the carpet repeated, over and over, with no sign of the staircase. My breathing got faster and I felt sweat trickle down my neck. My feet felt numb. I tried one door, but it was locked. I tried another. Same thing. I felt trapped. My chest felt tight and I clenched my fists. I decided to keep walking until I found something. Another door, a window, or a way out. The footsteps started again. This time, they seemed to match my pace. When I stopped, they stopped. When I walked, they followed. At one point I saw a silhouette at the far end of the corridor. It looked like a tall figure, but the fog blurred everything. I called out, asking for help. The figure turned and slipped behind a corner. I ran after it, ignoring my aching legs. When I rounded the corner, I saw nothing but more hallway. I smelled something sour, like old food gone bad. The walls looked damp, and the wallpaper peeled in wide strips. I felt the temperature drop even more. My teeth started chattering, and my breath came out in quick bursts. I heard a door creak open. I froze. A door about 10 feet away had opened by itself. There was no one near it. It just swung outward, inviting me inside. I thought about ignoring it, but I was desperate to find a path back to the lobby. I inched closer, peering into the room. The light was dim, but I could see a small table and 2 chairs. It looked like a lounge or reading room, with shelves lining the walls. The shelves were empty, though. No books, no decorations, just bare wood. I stepped inside, holding onto the doorframe, ready to run if I needed to. The air in that room felt heavier, like walking into a space with no ventilation. I checked the corners. I didn't see anyone. A faint glow came from a lamp in the corner, but it didn't flicker like the lights in the hallway. I walked over to it and touched the lamp's base. It was cold. No warmth at all, even though it was lit. That detail made my hands shake more. I called out again, but my voice sounded muffled. I could barely hear myself. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut on its own. The thud was so loud it made my ears ring. I lunged for the knob, but it was locked. I yanked on it. It didn't move. The footsteps were outside, shuffling around. They felt closer now. I pressed my ear to the door. I heard whispering. It sounded like the same voice as before, but I couldn't make out the words. My heart pounded so hard I felt dizzy. I pulled back and surveyed the room. There had to be another door or a window. I checked behind the shelves, but nothing. The walls were plain, except for a small vent near the ceiling. I grabbed one of the chairs and tried to stand on it to look in the vent, but it was too narrow. There was a pounding sound on the other side of the door, steady and slow, like someone hitting it with the palm of their hand. I braced myself, but nothing broke through. Then the sound stopped, replaced by scraping along the wall outside. I sat on the chair, trying to slow my breathing. My chest was tight and my legs felt weak. The air smelled stale, like the inside of a sealed box. I stayed there for a while, waiting, too scared to make a move. At some point I noticed the lamplight was dimming. It flickered once, then went out. I was plunged into darkness. My eyes adjusted, but all I could see was the faint outline of the furniture. I ran my hands along the walls, trying to find a switch or anything that could help. The door behind me rattled. I thought about screaming, but who would hear me? My throat felt locked up anyway. I tested the knob again. Still no luck. My palms were sweating so much that the knob felt slick. I felt the fog seeping under the crack at the bottom of the door, curling around my ankles. The cold pricked at my skin. The room was so quiet that the slightest sound made me jump. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I tried to focus on the present moment. I didn't want to pass out from panic. Suddenly, the door swung open. I stumbled back, raising my arms defensively. The corridor looked different. The fog was thicker, swirling in the hallway like a gray tide. I didn't see anyone. I took slow steps out of the room. The pounding in my chest eased a bit. I scanned left and right, but the corridor stretched in both directions without an exit. I decided to go left, walking with one hand on the wall. I kept my other hand out in front, trying to feel my way forward. The fog stung my eyes. I had to blink every few seconds. Those dragging footsteps started again, this time right behind me. I sped up. They sped up. I could feel my entire body tense. My arms shook, and my breath came out in ragged gasps. I pressed forward, telling myself there had to be stairs somewhere. Then I spotted a door with a small exit sign above it. It was faint, but it was there. I broke into a run. The fog clung to my legs. My shoes squeaked on the damp carpet. I reached the door and pushed with all my strength. It gave way, and I saw a narrow stairwell. A weak light bulb buzzed overhead. I rushed down the stairs. They led to another corridor on the first floor. This hallway looked familiar. I recognized the old wallpaper in the front desk near the lobby. The overhead lights were flickering. The windows by the entrance were covered in fog. It pressed against the glass, swirling in thick waves, like it wanted to come inside. I stepped into the lobby, looking for the front door. I saw it, but the outside was just a wall of white. I opened it anyway, hoping to reach my car. The second I stepped onto the porch, I realized it was pointless. The fog was everywhere. I couldn't see the railing or the steps. I felt a chill creep into my bones. The idea of wandering out there didn't make sense. I wouldn't find my car. I'd just be lost again. I turned back into the lobby. The lights flickered once more, and the old man from earlier appeared behind the desk. His expression was blank, like before. I approached him, heart pounding in my chest. I asked him if there was another way out, maybe a back door or a safe path down the mountain. He lifted his hand and pointed toward the staircase, but he didn't say anything. I backed away, my body tense. The lights flickered, and he was gone. No sound, no movement. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. I stood there shaking. I was trapped inside that hotel with the fog invading every corner. My name echoed somewhere in the halls, like a hushed chant. My shoes felt glued to the floor, and my breath came in short bursts. I glanced at the door again, saw nothing but swirling gray. The staircase behind me led to rooms and corridors that changed shape. I felt like the hotel itself was shifting, adapting, and closing off any chance of escape. I swallowed hard, tasting fear on my tongue. I didn't know where to go. The building groaned around me like it was alive. The wood creaked and the walls seemed to breathe. The sense of being watched weighed on me. I blinked sweat out of my eyes. My ears rang with silence, broken by the occasional whisper of my name. I felt a prickling sensation at the base of my skull. I was sure something was right behind me, just out of sight. I forced my legs to move, stepping away from the desk, scanning for a path through the swirling mist that seeped in under the doors. The fog had found its way inside, and I could barely see across the lobby. I heard doors opening and slamming on the second floor. The echo traveled down the old staircase, calling me back up. My hands trembled as I tried to gather my thoughts. I wasn't ready to give up. I wanted to find a phone or a radio, something that could connect me to the outside world. I took a shaky breath, looked around for a sign, and prepared myself for another climb into those dark corridors, unsure if I'd ever see the road again. I never expected to question my own senses on my first night in that apartment. Yet here I am, sitting in the living room with the lights on, trying to catch my breath. My heart races. My hands feel cold and damp. I rented this place to get some peace and quiet, but it hasn't offered me any relief. Every sound makes my muscles tighten. Every shadow looks suspicious. I keep thinking about the attic above me and the strange collection I found there. I want to explain exactly what happened, step by step, so it's clear I'm not imagining things. I moved in about a week ago. I'm a writer with a tight deadline, and I was tired of distractions. I saw an ad for this old apartment. The landlord showed me around quickly. The paint was peeling in some rooms and the floor creaked in the hallway. The rent was cheap. I didn't care about the musty smell or the old fixtures. I only wanted a quiet place where nobody would bother me. I signed the papers that same day. I remember unpacking boxes in the living room. I had 2 suitcases, 1 lamp, a laptop, and a few notebooks. I'm not a big collector of anything, so my move was easy. The first night was calm. I noticed the building settled a lot and the pipes in the wall made odd noises. That didn't surprise me. Old places come with weird creaks. I slept fine. The trouble started on the second day. I was looking for extra storage space. The landlord mentioned a small attic, so I climbed the narrow staircase near the bedroom to see if I could put some empty boxes there. The attic door was stuck. I pushed it hard. and it opened with a scraping sound. Dust fell around me, making me sneeze. I stepped inside with a flashlight in one hand. The air felt thick and stale. My flashlight beam landed on a cluttered arrangement of objects on a table against the far wall. I saw old clothes, pieces of jewelry, folded newspaper clippings, random coins and small trinkets like keys and broken watches. Each item had a little tag with a name written in faded ink. The names were strange. I couldn't pronounce half of them. I felt uneasy right away. The hair on my arms stood up. My chest felt tight. It was too quiet up there, except for the sound of my own breathing. I walked closer and lifted a small silver medallion. The name on the tag was something like A. Layton. I examined the edges. It was smooth and cold. I realized there was no reason for these items to still be here. Someone had labeled them, but they never took them away. I found a piece of old clothing, maybe a vest with a tag that said K-Rent. The vest smelled of mothballs and something else I couldn't identify. I felt a jolt of fear for no clear reason. I decided to leave the items alone for the time being. I didn't have a plan yet. I thought maybe the landlord left them or a previous tenant forgot about them. I went downstairs and tried to focus on my writing. At first, I managed to type a few pages. Then I heard a soft thumping noise coming from upstairs. It wasn't constant. It started and stopped randomly. I put my hands on the keyboard and waited. Nothing. I typed a sentence. Thump. My gut tightened. I got up and listened by the wall. The sound didn't return. That night I lay in bed wide awake. The hallway outside my bedroom was dark. I kept my door open so I would hear if something moved around. At some point, I dozed off. I had a dream where I was standing in the attic. I was surrounded by those labeled items. I heard something breathing behind me. I spun around, but I couldn't see anyone. Then I heard a slow laugh, low and garbled. The medallion on the table rattled against the wood. The door behind me slammed shut. I woke up with a shout. I was drenched in sweat. My throat felt tight. I couldn't sleep after that. I got up and splashed water on my face in the bathroom sink. When I checked my reflection, I noticed faint red marks on my left arm. They weren't deep, but they stung. I had no memory of scratching myself. My heart pounded as I pressed my fingers to the marks. They felt raw, as if caused by something sharp. But there was nothing in my bed that could have done that. The next morning, I decided I couldn't ignore the attic. I went back upstairs, determined to throw those items away. It didn't feel right to keep them around. I grabbed a large garbage bag from the kitchen. My plan was to load everything up and drop it at the dumpster behind the building. I started with an old coat. I stuffed it in the bag. Then I grabbed a cracked watch with a brass tag attached. As soon as I tossed it in, I heard the floor creak behind me. I turned fast, flashlight pointed across the room. I saw nothing. My ears felt hot. My palms were slick with sweat. I kept going. I picked up a tarnished mirror with initials on the back. I placed it in the bag, careful not to break it. Then I heard a dragging noise like something sliding across the floor. I scanned the attic but only saw the table and a few empty boxes. My chest felt tight again. I kept imagining someone else in that room with me. I marched downstairs with the bag. My breathing was shallow. Once I reached the front door, I heard this loud bang behind me. It sounded like a door slamming upstairs. Then I heard muffled laughter. It wasn't cheerful. It was slow and broken, almost like a wheeze. I felt a chill on my neck. My hand shook when I touched the doorknob. I carried the bag outside and around to the dumpster. I tossed it in without looking back. I stood there a moment, trying to calm down. Then I noticed the apartment's windows. The attic window was dark. A small part of me expected to see a face there, watching me, but I didn't see anyone. I felt some relief. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to get some work done on my laptop. About an hour later, I heard another bang from the attic. My chest jumped. I set my laptop aside and headed upstairs. Every step felt heavy. At the attic door, I hesitated. The air around me felt cold like a draft. I opened the door and flicked on the weak overhead bulb. The table was there, still cluttered with items. My mouth went dry. The coat, the mirror, the cracked watch were back on the table. They looked exactly like before, with the same tags, arranged the same way. There was no garbage bag in sight. I stood there, not sure what to do. My skin tingled. My stomach felt queasy. I turned around and ran back down the stairs. My feet pounded on each step. In my living room, I paced in circles. I kept thinking I might be losing it. I considered calling the landlord. I grabbed my phone and dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message telling him I needed to discuss the attic. My voice shook a little. That night I barely slept. I heard footsteps above me. Sometimes it sounded like something scraping along the floor. I covered my ears with my pillow and shut my eyes. Eventually, I drifted off. When I woke up in the morning, my arms and neck had more red marks. They looked like small scratches or burns. My sheets were crumpled and I had sweat through my t-shirt. My head pounded. I decided to inspect the attic again in daylight. I thought maybe the room would feel less threatening. The staircase felt a bit colder than the rest of the apartment. The overhead light flickered, casting quick shadows on the walls. I saw that same arrangement on the table. I picked up a newspaper clipping. It was dated decades ago. I couldn't find a normal article. It just had paragraphs cut off. One line mentioned something about an old house. I tried to piece it together, but the rest was missing. I moved some of the clothes aside. Underneath, I found a small metal box with a latch. The box had no label. I pried it open with my keys. Inside, I found half a dozen torn photographs. Each photo showed a person standing in front of some place I didn't recognize. Their faces were unclear, kind of faded. On the back of each photo, there were the same initials, A.L. or K.W., and a few others. They matched some of the tags I saw on the items. I felt a heaviness in my chest, like I couldn't inhale enough air. I placed the photos back and shut the box. I spent the afternoon downstairs writing. I forced myself to focus, but I kept hearing small noises from above. Sometimes it sounded like objects being moved around. Sometimes it was a faint voice. I caught myself trembling. I got up at least 3 times, double-checked the locks, and even checked the basement to make sure no one else was inside the building. I saw nothing out of place. Everything felt normal except for that attic. Around dinner time, I tried to relax in the living room. I ate a quick meal and flipped through some channels on TV. The volume didn't help. I still heard soft thumps overhead. My body tensed up. I considered leaving the apartment and never coming back, but I needed the space, and I had already paid for the next month. I felt stuck. I decided to try one more time to get rid of the stuff. I grabbed my car keys. I took a big cardboard box from the kitchen. I climbed into the attic with my flashlight and the overhead bulb. My plan was to load every single object into the box and drive it somewhere else. I didn't know where. Maybe a storage unit or a donation bin. I just wanted them gone. I took a deep breath and started collecting the items. The clothes, the medallions, the scraps of newspaper, the keys, the mirror, the coins, everything I could fit inside. I worked fast. My heart thumped, and my eyes darted to every corner of the attic. I heard a low whisper behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight. Nothing. I finished packing. I closed the box, carried it down, and placed it in the trunk of my car. I felt shaky but determined. I drove out of the neighborhood, searching for a place to dump it. I found an old strip mall with a donation drop box in the back. It was dark and empty. I parked, pulled out the cardboard box, and set it next to the donation container. I didn't look back. I got in my car and drove home, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. When I entered the apartment, it felt quiet. I thought I had solved the problem. I took a long shower, letting the hot water soothe my tense muscles. Then I went to bed. It was the first time in days I felt somewhat calm. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of a door slamming upstairs. I felt my blood run cold. Then came that laughter again, low and uneven. The room spun. My stomach lurched. I forced myself out of bed. My legs felt numb. I stumbled to the attic steps. The door was open, light flickering. I climbed up, my heart pounding so hard it made my temples ache. There on the table sat every single item: the clothes, the mirror, the coins, the watch, the clippings. The cardboard box was nowhere in sight. The tags were laid out neatly, each name in the same faded ink. My hands started shaking. I had the urge to scream, but no sound came out. I swear I felt someone breathing behind me. I turned around fast, but there was only empty space. The overhead bulb buzzed. My ears rang. My throat felt tight and my pulse hammered in my ears. I saw the shadows on the walls move for a split second. I staggered backward, almost lost my balance, and grabbed the table for support. The laughter died down, replaced by silence so heavy it hurt my ears. I stumbled back down the stairs, breathing hard, my forehead dripping with sweat. I'm standing in the living room now, telling you this. I can still hear occasional creaks up there. My arms and neck still sting with new scratches. I called the landlord again, but he didn't pick up. I'm not staying here anymore. I'm packing my suitcase, grabbing my laptop, and leaving the rest behind. I don't know if I'll get my deposit back. I don't care. Something in that attic doesn't want those objects to leave. I don't think it wants me to leave either. But I'm not staying to find out what else might happen. I'm going to walk out the door, lock it, and never come back. My hands are shaking, but I can't stay here another night. I don't trust the quiet. I don't trust the dark. Those labeled objects aren't normal. I don't understand how they keep coming back. And I'm not waiting for an explanation. I'm leaving. That's the whole story. That's exactly what happened. Exactly what I saw and heard. I'm never renting a cheap old place just for solitude again. I'd rather work in a noisy city than spend another minute in a place like this. I gripped the iron gate and pushed it open. It groaned so loudly that I felt my ears twitch. The property looked dead. The garden was dry. The fountain was full of stagnant water, and the mansion loomed ahead like a bad memory. I had heard rumors about a hidden art collection inside, and I was hired to assess it. The pay was good, and I wanted the job done in one night. I arrived at sunset. I planned to walk through every room, make my notes, and leave before dawn. I'm not a superstitious guy, but the thought of staying in that place after midnight felt wrong. I told myself to ignore the feeling. I reached the front door. The wood was cracked, and the handle felt loose. I pressed down on it, and the door swung inward. The air inside hit me. It was damp and cold, with an odd smell. I took a step and felt my shoes sink into the dusty carpet. Thick dust flew around me when I moved. I coughed. I hadn't expected the place to be this neglected. I checked my flashlight, tested its beam, then flicked on the overhead lights. They worked, but they were dim and yellowish. Good enough, I thought. The corridor stretched out in front of me, and on the walls, I saw the outlines of paintings. Dozens of them, maybe more. I walked toward the first portrait on the right. It showed a man in an old-fashioned suit with gray hair brushed back. His eyes were dark, and they looked intense. I wrote down a few details in my notebook. Unknown subject, early 19th century style, possibly local artist, heavy oils. Then I stared at the eyes again. It felt like they were on me. But I thought that was normal for old portraits. The artists often painted them to create that stare effect. I shrugged it off. I turned around and aimed my flashlight at the next painting. This one showed a woman in a pale dress. Her gaze pointed off to the side, but something about her expression looked strange. It was like she was holding a secret. Again, I felt that sensation of eyes following me. I told myself it was the atmosphere. The house was ancient, the light was bad, and I was alone. I made my way to the main gallery. The door was huge and the handle was shaped like a lion's head. I pulled it and the hinges screeched. Inside, the space was bigger than I expected. There were high ceilings, a chandelier with missing crystals, and rows of paintings lined up on the walls. Some were wrapped in cloth, some were displayed on easels, and some leaned against the walls without frames. My footsteps echoed on the bare floor. Each step sounded louder than it should have. The place felt hollow. I noticed a table in the center, covered with old newspapers, cloth rags, and empty metal paint tubes. They looked ancient. I approached them and picked one up. The label was faded, but the words linseed oil were still visible. It was dry and crunchy. I looked around and saw a thick layer of dust on the table, but there were streaks where something or someone had moved items. That's when I got a chill. It wasn't a breeze. There were no open windows, but my arms got goosebumps. I took a deep breath and headed toward the first row of paintings. Each one showed a different face. Some wore old-fashioned suits or dresses, some looked more modern, and some had no date or name. The frames ranged from gilded Baroque styles to simple wooden shapes. I counted around 10 portraits in that row. They all seemed to watch me in unison. Every time I turned my back, I got the feeling something shifted. I spun around quickly a few times, but they looked the same. My stomach knotted. I checked my watch. It was just after 8 p.m. I had a long night ahead. I moved closer to one painting, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a slight smirk. I wrote down notes. Oil on canvas, approximate mid-1800s, frame is chipped, needs restoration. While I wrote, I swore the smirk changed. I blinked, then looked at the painting again. The smirk looked bigger, like the corners of his mouth were curling up. I felt my pulse speed up. I glanced around to see if there was any shift in light that caused a shadow, but everything looked the same. I took a few steps back and it looked normal again. My heart thumped. I reminded myself that old paintings often have illusions depending on the angle of the light. I forced myself to keep going. As I continued down the row, I heard a faint sound behind me. It was like a shuffle or maybe a step on the wood floor. I spun around, pointing my flashlight across the gallery. Nothing moved. I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed, no reply. The house was empty, at least that's what I was told. I noticed my breathing was faster and my hands felt sweaty. I wiped them on my pants and clenched my jaw. I decided to ignore it. I had work to do. I approached another portrait. This one was different from the others. It showed a man in partial profile wearing a half-finished expression. The background was dark, and I could see brush strokes that looked incomplete around his face. His left eye was more detailed than the right one. The edges of the canvas were frayed like it was never properly mounted. I reached out to touch the frame, and that's when I heard a voice. It sounded like a whisper, but it was direct, like someone speaking right next to my ear. "Finish me." I froze. My body felt rigid. I moved the flashlight around, searching for a person. I checked behind the painting, under the table, near the door. No one was there. My heart pounded, and I felt a sweat breaking out under my collar. The voice had been distinct. It was masculine, soft, but urgent. I stood still, trying to control my breathing. My mind raced. I thought maybe the wind carried a voice from outside, or maybe I was just tired. But it sounded too real to be my imagination. I didn't see any open window or any vent that could carry a noise like that. I waited for a few seconds, but the house was silent again, except for my heartbeat. I tried to refocus. I wrote down more notes about the incomplete painting, but my hand was shaking. Every few seconds I glanced at the man's face on the canvas. His eyes looked aware, like they were examining me. I couldn't stare too long. It made me feel sick. I forced myself to move on to the next painting. It showed a woman in a large hat, looking straight at the viewer. As I stared, the corners of her eyes seemed to lift, like she was adjusting her gaze. I backed away. I felt a surge of adrenaline. My breathing got loud. I rubbed my eyes. I told myself I was just seeing things in the dim light. I heard a new sound behind me, a shuffle, then a soft tap, like a shoe on the floor. I spun around again, shining the flashlight all over the gallery. The paintings loomed everywhere. Their expressions seemed sharper. I tried to stay calm, but my legs felt shaky. I stepped away from the row and stood in the middle of the room. The chandelier above me swung slightly. I couldn't see any wind source, yet it moved. The crystals clicked together, producing a soft clinking sound that echoed. Then I heard the whisper again. "Finish me." This time, it lasted longer. "Finish me before the sun comes up." The voice came from the direction of the incomplete portrait. I stared at it from across the room. The man's face in the painting looked more detailed now. The right eye seemed almost complete, whereas before it was just rough strokes. My throat went dry. I stepped toward it. With each step, I felt my heartbeat slam in my chest. My breath came in short bursts. I moved the flashlight over the painting, examining the surface. The paint didn't look wet, but it seemed fresh. The detail in the brushwork had changed. That's impossible, I thought. Paintings don't change on their own. I backed off. I felt an urge to run out of the house, but my instructions were clear. Evaluate the collection, gather all the data, and lock up. I needed the payment. I swallowed the fear, took a quick look at my watch, and saw it was just past 9 p.m. I decided to keep going, but faster. I would inspect each row of paintings, jot down the basics, and get out. As I walked to the next section of the gallery, my flashlight started flickering. I tapped it a few times and it steadied. The overhead lights were still on, but they were dimmer now. The hallway next to the gallery looked pitch black. I planned to stick to the main room where there was some light. The next few paintings were landscapes. They showed old buildings, fields, and forests. They felt less threatening. I examined them quickly, wrote a few notes, and then moved to the final section. More portraits. I walked up to a large painting that was covered by a cloth. I pulled the cloth off, letting the dust float into my nose. I sneezed, then shone my flashlight on the surface. The painting showed a tall figure wearing a coat and looking downward. The face was partially visible, but there was a definite scowl. The eyes seemed to stare at something off canvas. I jotted down the details. As I leaned in, I noticed tiny cracks in the paint that formed around the figure's eyes. They looked like veins or branching lines. I ran my finger over the frame and felt small splinters. Suddenly, the overhead lights dimmed even more, and one flickered out completely. The gallery felt darker. I heard another set of footsteps. This time, they came from the corridor outside. They weren't loud, but they were steady, one step at a time. I turned off my flashlight to see if I could spot any movement in the faint light. I waited, staring at the open door. The footsteps stopped right at the threshold. I saw nothing. My chest felt tight. I turned the flashlight back on, pointed it at the door, and shouted, "Who's there?" My voice shook a bit. I heard no answer. I dashed to the doorway and looked out into the corridor. It was empty. The only thing I saw were old paintings on the walls and the worn carpet. I felt a drop of sweat slide down my temple. I returned to the gallery and tried to calm myself. I inhaled deeply, but the dusty air made me cough. My phone vibrated in my pocket, and I jumped. It was an alarm reminding me to check in with my client. I grabbed my phone to see if I had any signal. The screen showed no bars. I tried to place a call anyway, but it failed. No service in that old mansion. I told myself I'd try again outside once I finished. I stuffed the phone back into my pocket and forced myself to keep working. I made my way back to the incomplete portrait, the one that whispered to me. The voice had gone silent for a while. I decided to examine it more closely. As I approached, I saw fresh brushstrokes on the background. The figure's right eye looked almost finished now, a stark contrast to the left side of the face. My stomach churned. Something was changing the painting in real time, and I had no explanation for it. I wanted to touch it, but I hesitated. The voice had said, "Finish me." Finish how? I didn't have paint or brushes. I stood there, feeling confused and scared. My mouth felt dry. Then the voice returned. "Pick up the brush." It sounded soft but commanding. I saw something near the base of the easel. It was a thin paintbrush with dried red paint on the tip. I had walked by this spot before, and I hadn't seen any brush there. My throat tightened. I told myself to remain calm. I bent down and picked it up. The handle was cold, and some paint chips flaked off into my hand. I stood there, not sure what to do. My pulse hammered in my ears. I whispered, "What do you want?" The painting didn't move, but the voice answered, "Complete the face." My hands trembled. I looked around for paints, but all I saw were old tubes on that center table. They were empty. I saw no fresh paint. The voice said, "Hurry." I felt an irrational need to obey, as if something was compelling me to try. I walked to the table, rummaged through the dusty items, but I found nothing usable. Only dried-up tubes, brittle pallets, and rags. My frustration grew, and I felt my heart rate soar. I was angry, but also terrified. I shouted, "I don't have what I need." I heard footsteps again, circling the gallery. They never came close enough for me to see anything. They just circled, slow and steady. The echo sounded like it was all around. My grip on the paintbrush tightened. I returned to the painting and ran my finger over the canvas surface. The texture was rough, and I felt a slight warmth. My head started pounding. A wave of dizziness hit me, and I leaned against the easel for support. I stared into the painted eyes. They looked aware, as if the figure was trying to speak through them. I felt another whisper near my ear. "You have me. Use it." I didn't understand. My chest felt heavy. My breathing turned shallow. My hands were slick with sweat, and I clenched the brush so hard my knuckles ached. I pressed the tip against the canvas. It was dry. There was no paint on it. Yet when I moved the brush slightly, a line appeared on the painting like a dark stroke. I jerked my hand back. My head spun. I tried it again, sliding the brush across another part of the canvas. More color appeared, filling in the missing outlines of the man's ear. I watched it happen. No tube of paint, no open jar. But somehow the brush delivered fresh pigment. It scared me. I stepped back, not wanting to continue. But the footsteps outside grew louder, and the voice whispered, "Finish me before sunrise." My watch read 10:30 p.m. I realized I had hours to go until morning. The thought of staying here with these footsteps and changing portraits made my stomach churn. I didn't know if finishing the painting would make any difference, but the voice kept pushing me. I took another breath, placed the brush on the canvas, and painted the areas that were incomplete. My strokes were shaky, and I'm not a skilled painter, but the paint glided on smoothly. It seemed to shape itself. As I did this, I heard soft breathing behind me. Every hair on my neck stood on end. I tried not to look back. I focused on the canvas. My hand felt forced. Each time I hesitated, a tightness wrapped around my chest. I felt like if I didn't obey, I would collapse. I kept painting. The brush filled in details of the nose, the forehead, the shading under the eyes. The face looked more alive with each stroke. The footsteps circled faster, like they were on a loop around the gallery. I could hear them scraping the wood floor. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered again. The chandelier trembled, and I heard the crystals clink. I looked at my watch. It was nearly midnight. My heart pounded. I needed to finish whatever I was doing. The painting's face was almost complete, except for the mouth. I lifted the brush to fill that in. The voice whispered, "Yes," in a long breath. As I painted, the shape of the lips came through, forming a faint smile. My hand shook, and a drop of sweat fell onto the canvas. The final stroke sealed the painting. The face looked whole now. I stepped back, blinking away the sweat. My arms felt weak, and my stomach turned with nausea. But the footsteps stopped. The chandelier became still. I waited, hoping the voice would speak again. It was silent. I turned my head, scanning the other portraits. They looked normal. Their expressions weren't shifting. The oppressive feeling in the gallery lifted a bit. I could breathe easier. I wiped my forehead and set the brush down on the table, my hands still trembling. I felt drained, like I had run a marathon. I walked toward the incomplete portrait to examine it. The paint looked dry, even though I had just applied it. The colors were vibrant, and the figure's eyes had a calm expression, not like the frantic look from before. I touched the canvas lightly, and it felt cold. No warmth, no whisper, nothing. The silence felt heavy, but not suffocating. I looked around and realized the other paintings weren't staring at me. They were just portraits now. I grabbed my notebook, stuffed it into my bag, and headed straight for the door. My legs felt shaky, and I had to steady myself on the walls. The corridor was quiet. The paintings on either side had neutral expressions. I didn't sense any movement in their eyes. I reached the front door without looking back. My mind was jumbled, but I knew I had to get out. I turned the handle and stepped into the cold night air. I felt relief as the fresh air hit my face. I walked to my car, started it, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, breathing hard. I looked at the mansion's silhouette in the rearview mirror. The windows were dark and the place looked like a shadow. I didn't hear any voices, I didn't see any figure. It was just a silent, looming house now. I started driving away, checking the time. It was just after midnight. My hands were still sweating on the wheel. I decided I wouldn't come back no matter how much money was offered. I had finished something in that painting, and that was enough for me. I drove off, leaving the mansion behind, not caring about the final evaluation. I wanted to forget that place and everything that happened. I still felt my heart pounding the entire drive home. I moved into this loft because it was cheap, and I liked the idea of having just a single room to clean. I never expected to deal with anything strange here. I'm a simple person. I like straightforward things. I spend my time working, eating, and sleeping. That's how it was before I noticed the outline on my wall. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, step by step, in the hope that getting it off my chest will help me breathe easier. I'm not trying to sound dramatic. I just want to be clear about what I saw and what I felt. I noticed the faint glow one night while I was brushing my teeth. I shut off the bathroom light, and the loft was mostly dark except for a bit of street light that seeped through the main window. As I walked toward my bed, something caught my eye on the wall to the left. It wasn't a reflection, and it wasn't a random light from outside. It looked like a thin border in the shape of a rectangle, glowing with a weak white shimmer. It was about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, situated near the corner about waist-high from the floor. My first thought was that maybe there was some wiring behind the plaster, and it was somehow reacting to the darkness. It made no sense, but I couldn't think of any other explanation. I turned on the overhead lamp and the glow vanished. The wall looked normal under the light. I turned the lamp back off. The outline was there again. It wasn't bright, but it stood out enough to draw my attention. I decided it was late, and I felt a bit silly hovering around my wall. I tried to ignore it. I took one last glance at the rectangle and went to bed. When I woke up the next morning, it was gone. I felt relieved. Maybe it was just a trick of the eyes. I went through my usual day, came home around 8 at night, cooked some scrambled eggs, and scrolled through my phone until I got tired. As soon as I turned the main light off, I saw it again. Same spot, same faint glow. I stood there for a while, staring at it. I couldn't explain it. I got closer and ran my fingers over that section of the wall. The surface felt normal. It felt like painted drywall. Nothing unusual. Then I put my ear against the wall. It sounded solid. There was no wind, no draft, nothing. I pushed against it. It was firm. I walked backward until I was near my bed and sat down, keeping my eyes on this glowing outline. My loft is small, so I could keep an eye on the wall from there. I sat for maybe 10 minutes, expecting it to fade. It didn't. It stayed clear. The shape looked exactly like a window, just smaller than a standard one. After a while, I decided I'd had enough. I turned on the TV for background noise, and that was that. But the next night, it changed. I got home and, as usual, waited for darkness. That glowing border returned. This time, the interior part of that rectangle looked different. It was like a faint swirl of shadows behind the outline. It reminded me of a screen with static, except it was slow and somewhat fluid. My gut tightened. I walked over and stood in front of it. The swirl moved around like shapes in a fog. I suddenly had the urge to poke it. My hands started sweating. I didn't know what I was doing, but I reached forward. My fingers didn't pass through the wall. It was still solid, but the outline flickered a bit, and I noticed something shift in that swirling interior. It wasn't clear, but it looked like some shape was there, not just random darkness. It was some hunched figure, but I couldn't see it well. I felt my heart pound. I stumbled backward. I almost tripped over the corner of my rug. I stood there, breathing heavily, my arms tingling with adrenaline. I stayed like that for a while, not sure what to do. Eventually, I sat on my couch and stared at the wall until I fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning, the glow was gone. I hurried to work and tried not to think about it. My mind kept drifting back, though. I kept wondering if I had actually seen that figure. I even entertained the idea that I was just exhausted and seeing things. But that night it came back, and it was worse. I turned the lights off around 10 like usual. The outline glowed, the swirl appeared, and I saw movement within that rectangular area. This time, it looked like a wide space on the other side. It was like a room in darkness, but it didn't seem like a normal room. The walls on that other side looked uneven, as if they were melted or bulging out. And I saw shapes. They were around my own height or taller, but their outlines were all crooked, with limbs that seemed bent at weird angles. My scalp tightened, and my hands started shaking. I didn't want to look away, though. My curiosity was overpowering my fear. I watched those shapes move around on the other side like they were pacing or searching for something. Now and then, one of them turned in my direction. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I sensed it was looking right at me. My chest felt heavy. I considered running out of the loft, but I stayed. It was my place, and I didn't know if ignoring it would even help. I inched forward, my heart pounding in my ears. I whispered, "Hello?" I have no idea why I said that, but it just came out. One of the shapes walked closer to the glowing border on its side. It had a head that was tilted to the side, and its arms dangled unevenly. Its torso was twisted. It paused right in front of the rectangle, like it was peering at me through glass. Then I saw it lift an arm. Long, thin fingers pressed against what looked like a barrier. I heard a faint tapping sound on my side. The sound was quiet, like a fingertip tapping on the inside of a hollow surface. The hair on my neck stood up. My stomach twisted. I felt my feet tingling with the urge to run. I backed away step by step, not taking my eyes off that shape. The tapping continued for a few seconds, and then the shape lowered its arm. It seemed to communicate with another figure behind it. I saw them turning their heads, making slow movements. Then the outline flickered and went dark. The rectangle faded until it was just the ordinary wall again. I barely slept that night. I kept the lights on until early morning. My mind raced with questions. I wondered if I was hallucinating, but it felt too real. The next evening, I dreaded coming home. But I had no choice. I needed to handle this somehow. I walked in around 7, took a shower, and tried to relax. I got a small flashlight and kept it in my pocket, just in case. When I finally turned off the lights at night, the rectangle glowed. My heart pounded as soon as I saw it. My mouth felt dry and my hands were slick with sweat. I forced myself to approach it again. The swirl inside looked more defined now, like I could see part of that twisted room more clearly. The shapes were there, moving around. One of them faced me immediately, as if it expected me. It approached the barrier, lifted its arms, and placed them flat against what I assume was the dividing line. A dull tap echoed on my side. I couldn't ignore it. It was real. I heard it. It was like a short series of knocks, as if it wanted me to respond. I stepped closer, trying to keep my breathing steady. My knees felt weak, but I managed to stand. I raised my hand and pressed my palm against the wall, aligning it with where that creature's palm might be on the other side. The wall felt cold. I heard another sequence of knocks, faster this time. The creature's head was near the top of the rectangle, leaning forward. I thought I saw a glint where an eye should be, but it was hard to make out. My mind buzzed with 1,000 thoughts, but I just stayed there, hand to wall, breathing in shallow bursts. The thing pulled back. I watched it move away into that dark place. Another figure replaced it, sliding into view. This second figure looked shorter, but it also had limbs that were oddly bent. It tapped the barrier and then pressed itself against it, almost like it was testing the strength. A slow scraping noise sounded on my side. My skin crawled, my stomach churned. I took my hand off the wall and stepped back. A wave of dizziness hit me. I grabbed a nearby chair to keep from falling. The second figure moved away, and then the entire outline flickered and went dark. I stared at the wall. It was normal again, plain and unremarkable. I didn't dare touch it again. I turned on every light in the loft. I paced around, checking that corner every few minutes, but the rectangle was gone for the rest of the night. Over the next few days, I noticed something new. Even during the day, if I stared at that spot long enough, I could sense a slight distortion, like a ripple in the air. It was extremely subtle, but it was there. My stress level was through the roof. I'd sit at work, tapping my pen against the desk, counting the minutes until I had to go home. I started staying out later, visiting a friend who lived nearby, just to avoid being alone in my loft at night. But I couldn't stay away forever. Eventually, I had to face it. One night I came back around midnight. I was exhausted. I flipped on the overhead light, locked my door, and avoided looking at the wall. I made a quick sandwich, sat at the table, and focused on my phone. After a while, my eyes drifted toward that corner. Even with the light on, I could see a faint glow creeping from under the paint. It was as if the rectangle was fighting to be noticed. My shoulders stiffened. I stood up and walked over. I kept the light on this time and pressed my ear to the wall. I heard a soft hum or buzz, like electricity in the distance. I felt an odd vibration in my fingertips, like a gentle pulse. I switched the overhead light off. The glow became brighter. Inside, I could see the twisted room again and at least 2 or 3 figures pacing. One of them came close and placed its hands against the barrier. The tapping began. I felt my eyes burn because I forgot to blink. I swallowed hard and said, "What do you want?" I didn't expect an answer, and I didn't get a direct reply. But it tapped again, more insistent. Then I heard a sort of muffled scraping, like nails against metal. The figure's face pressed closer. The features were unclear, but I sensed wide, dark eyes and a jaw that looked too narrow. I couldn't handle it. I yanked on the overhead light cord. The rectangle flickered out. The glow died. I let out a shaky breath and stumbled to my bed, grabbing my phone in case I needed to call someone. My mind was racing. I lay there, unable to sleep, just staring at the wall with every light on. The outline didn't come back that night, but I felt its presence. The next day, I decided to test something. I got a thick piece of wood from a hardware store, a little bigger than the rectangle's dimensions, and I propped it against the wall. I wanted to see if it would block the glow. That night it didn't. The glow actually outlined the wood, and I could see the swirling shapes behind it, as if the barrier was pushing through any obstacle. I pounded on the board with my fist, hoping the creatures would hear it and maybe back off. It didn't do much, though. I still heard faint scraping from the other side. By the 5th night of this, I noticed changes in my loft. The air felt heavier, like there was less oxygen. I started coughing more. The lights would flicker sometimes, even though I replaced the bulbs, and that swirling window seemed to stay active longer. Some nights I couldn't get rid of it, no matter how many lights I turned on. The creatures kept appearing, and their tapping grew louder. I started hearing soft thuds like they were trying to push harder. The barrier made cracking sounds like thin ice under pressure. I thought about leaving the loft for good, but I was afraid that if I just ran away, something worse would happen. I had a feeling the connection to that other place was tied to me somehow. Maybe it wasn't rational, but I felt responsible. I didn't want to risk them breaking through while I wasn't there. At least if I stayed, I could watch the situation. One evening, the tapping escalated. I was on the couch, staring at the rectangle, and I heard a series of sharp knocks. Then a loud thump echoed through the loft. I jumped, my heart nearly stopping. The shape in the window slammed what looked like its entire arm against the barrier. I saw a slight crack in the swirling surface, like a spiderweb pattern. My eyes went wide. I felt a jolt of cold fear shoot through my stomach. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. I stood up slowly. My legs felt numb. The shape drew back its arm and slammed again. Another crack appeared in that swirling rectangle. I could actually see lines in the glow as if something was fracturing. My head pounded. I ran to the kitchen area and grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cast iron skillet. I hurried back to the wall, not sure what I was planning to do with it. I yelled, "Stop it!" My voice cracked. I felt ridiculous, but I was desperate. The creature paused. It stayed there, pressed against the barrier while the cracks in the glowing surface flickered. I saw another figure join it, and they stood side by side, their silhouettes tall and twisted. They tapped in unison, creating a strange rhythm. My teeth chattered. My arms and shoulders were clenched so tight they hurt. I gripped the skillet until my knuckles turned white. Then they stopped. The creatures lowered their arms and the cracks seemed to fade out. The swirling returned to normal and the shapes backed away into that dark place. I waited, barely breathing, for something else to happen, but the rectangle eventually dimmed. The glow faded away, leaving the wall blank. I slumped to the floor, tears of relief welling up. My muscles burned with tension. I stayed there on the floor for a long time, hugging the skillet. Eventually, I crawled to my bed, left all the lights on, and tried to rest. I couldn't sleep much, but I felt better knowing they had retreated. For the next few nights, the rectangle appeared but remained calm. The creatures walked around on the other side, but they didn't slam or crack the barrier again. It was as if they were waiting for me to drop my guard. I stayed alert. My nerves felt shot. I'd jump at every little noise. But I felt safer knowing I hadn't seen them attempt another break. I kept the skillet close. I don't know what good it would do if they broke through, but it felt like a tiny bit of security. That's how I've been living. Every night the rectangle glows. Every night I see those distorted shapes. Sometimes they tap or push, but they haven't cracked the barrier again. I still fear they might break it someday. I can't explain this window and I can't explain these creatures. I only know they're there and they seem aware of me. I feel watched, almost hunted, but I won't leave yet. This is my place, and for now, the barrier is holding. I don't know how long it'll last, but I'm still here. That's my story. That's what's really happening in my loft. I can't promise a happy ending, because I'm living it right now. I just hope this doesn't get any worse, because if they manage to get through, I have no idea how to stop them. I arrived at the house late in the afternoon. The driveway was cracked and the front steps creaked under my weight. I felt a wave of discomfort when I looked at the peeling paint on the siding. I never liked this place, but I had things to do here. I wanted to check the rooms, take anything I left behind, and leave. That was my plan. I didn't expect to discover a boarded-up door in the living room. I didn't expect to hear faint whispers from the other side. I stood there, staring at those old planks nailed into the wall, feeling a tight knot in my stomach. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't look away. I decided to deal with it, though I didn't fully understand why. I pushed the front door shut behind me. The hinges squealed. The house smelled stale, like dust and stale air. There was a thin coat of grime on the windows. The living room was mostly empty. An old sofa stood in the middle, covered by a dirty sheet. The floorboards creaked under my feet. I walked around to see if the electricity still worked. I flicked a light switch on the wall, but nothing happened. I moved to the next one, tried again. Nothing. I felt a chill in the air. There was still a bit of sunlight outside, so I decided to open some windows to let in fresh air. When I moved to the far corner of the living room, that's when I noticed the large wooden boards nailed diagonally over a doorway. They weren't there the last time I visited. I stepped closer and my stomach clenched. The boards looked old and splintered. Some nails were rusted, bent at odd angles. I wondered why anyone would seal off a doorway like that. I leaned in, pressed my ear against one of the boards and listened. At first I didn't hear anything. Then I heard a soft knock, like someone tapping on concrete. It was faint, but it made the hair on my arms stand up. The moment I heard it, I felt a wave of nausea. I backed away, holding my hand over my mouth. I tried to steady my breathing, thinking maybe it was just my nerves. But that knocking continued. It was slow, rhythmic, almost inviting. I couldn't ignore it. I turned away for a moment to gather my thoughts. My mind raced. Why was there a sealed door in my old house? I brushed my hand over my forehead. My skin felt clammy. I decided to ignore the door for a while and check the rest of the house. I needed to see if there was any sign of forced entry or damage. I walked down the hallway toward the old kitchen. The floors groaned, and the walls felt like they were pressing in on me. I kept shaking off a feeling that the house was breathing. The kitchen was mostly bare. A small wooden table was in the corner, and a few broken chairs leaned against the wall. I noticed a sudden tremor in the floor, like a small vibration. The table rattled slightly. I placed a hand on the counter. It felt steady, but I had sensed something. I looked at the ceiling light fixture. It was swaying gently, even though there was no draft. A cold sweat formed on my forehead. I wondered if there was an earthquake. I froze, listening for any rumbling outside, but all I heard was silence. My heart pounded in my chest. Something felt off. I returned to the living room and the door was still there, sealed. The boards almost seemed to shift in the dim light. My pulse quickened, and a strange feeling pulled me closer. I walked over to the door and ran my fingers along the edges. The nails were hammered in deeply, but some of them were crooked and the wood felt brittle. Something about that quiet tapping on the other side was drawing me in. I couldn't shake it. The air around me felt thick, like it was pressing down on my lungs. I inhaled and exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm. I decided I wasn't going to leave without checking behind those boards. I grabbed a hammer from a small toolbox I found in the hallway closet. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to approach the sealed doorway. When I placed the claw of the hammer under one of the nails, I heard a whisper. I jumped back, almost dropping the hammer. It was a low, raspy murmur. I couldn't make out words. It sounded like it was coming from deep inside that space. I clenched my teeth and tugged at the nail. It came loose with a loud screech. My heart raced. I set the nail aside and moved to the next one. Each nail resisted, but I kept going. The tapping on the other side grew louder. As soon as I pried the first board free, the smell of damp stone hit me. It reminded me of a wet basement or an old cellar. My stomach churned. I pulled away another board. A stronger wave of nausea rolled through me. My vision blurred for a second. The tapping sounded closer now, and the whispers were more intense. I set my hammer down, took a deep breath, and leaned forward. The gap in the boards revealed a set of steps going down. They were concrete covered in dust and cobwebs. My hands trembled. I put a foot on the first step. It felt cold and slightly damp. I found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer earlier, so I turned it on and aimed the beam through the narrow opening. The light revealed a basement area I had never seen before. The walls looked rough, with cracks in some places. The air felt thick. Every breath I took felt like a strain. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. I could hear more whispers, but I couldn't see anyone there. I didn't call out. I just stood, holding the flashlight, feeling my heart thud. I forced myself to pull away the last board. It clattered to the floor. The noise echoed in the empty living room. The opening was now wide enough for me to squeeze through. I felt a chill spread across my arms. There was no reason for a draft, but my body shook like I was in front of an open freezer. The whispers seemed to form a pattern. It reminded me of a low chant, rising and falling every few seconds. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry. I pointed the flashlight down the steps and started descending. Each step felt like it gave a little under my weight, like the concrete was hollow. I gripped the railing, which was rusted and unsteady. My flashlight beam shook from my trembling hand, casting shifting shadows on the walls. The basement air felt heavier the deeper I went. My lungs felt tight, and my stomach kept turning in circles. I paused halfway down when I heard a sudden bang behind me, like something hitting the door upstairs. I spun around, pointing the flashlight back up, but the doorway was empty. My mind raced. I thought maybe the door had slammed shut on its own, but I could still see the living room. The boards I removed were scattered on the floor. Nothing moved up there. I continued down. When I reached the bottom step, I saw a concrete floor covered with bits of debris and dirt. There were no windows, just stone walls and a low ceiling. The smell of dampness was overwhelming. I felt an urge to step back, but I couldn't. There was something about the darkness ahead that drew me forward. My flashlight revealed an old chair in the corner, its metal frame rusted, seat torn. A faint scraping sound came from somewhere in front of me. I couldn't see anything there, just an empty space. I took a few steps across the floor. The scraping stopped, replaced by a soft series of knocks on the far wall. My legs felt weak, and I steadied myself by reaching out to a support beam. The wood was slimy, and I jerked my hand away. My breathing was fast. I felt beads of sweat running down my face. I noticed the floor was uneven, with small cracks that branched out like spider legs. The knocks continued, 3 at a time, then silence, then 3 again. My heart pounded with each sequence. I felt my stomach lurch again. I bent forward, worried I might vomit. My throat burned, but I managed to keep it down. The air tasted stale. I wanted to turn around and rush back upstairs, but my legs felt heavy, like I was stuck in thick mud. I pressed on, shining the flashlight toward the source of the knocking. The beam caught a patch of the wall that looked damp. There was a faint trickle of water running down the stones, making a tiny puddle on the ground. I stepped closer. The knocking seemed to come from right behind that wet section of the wall. I raised my free hand and placed it on the stone. It felt cold and slick. I listened closely. The whispers were there, right on the other side. They sounded like they were just inches away from my ear, but the stone was between us. I clenched my jaw, trying to focus. My mind raced with half-formed thoughts. A hidden room, a buried space, maybe an old well. I felt dizzy. My body was telling me to leave. I turned away from the wall and faced the open space of the basement. The chair in the corner creaked like someone put weight on it. My flashlight flickered. I smacked it with my palm, and it steadied again. The chair was still empty, but it rocked slightly, scraping against the floor. My throat tightened. My pulse throbbed against my temples. The chants in my head were louder now, though I couldn't tell if it was real or just my imagination. The floor vibrated again, like something deep below was shifting. I wanted to speak, but my mouth felt glued shut. I wanted to call out, "Who's there?" But my voice wouldn't come. My brain urged me to move. My feet felt rooted for a second, but I forced them to shuffle toward the stairs. I aimed my flashlight at the steps, but the light only reached halfway up. The rest was dark. I couldn't see the living room anymore. My heart sank. I thought about how the boards might have slid back into place, but that was impossible. They were in a pile when I left them. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud from behind me. It was close, maybe only a few feet away. I spun around, raising the flashlight, but saw nothing except that dark, open space. My ears rang. I needed to get out. My body was shaking so hard that the flashlight beam danced on the walls. I forced my legs to move faster. I headed for the stairs, and as I put my foot on the bottom step, I heard a voice. It was clearer than before. It said my name, only once, but it sounded harsh. I whipped around, shining the light at the floor. Still nothing. I almost fell on the steps, trying to climb them too quickly. My breath came in heaving gasps. Each footstep echoed, and it felt like the echo was right behind me, like there was another set of footsteps chasing me. The air grew heavier with every second. By the time I reached the top, I was panting. I stumbled through the doorway and tumbled onto the living room floor. My ribs hurt from the impact. I lay there on my side, staring at the basement entrance, feeling a fierce throbbing in my chest. The boards were still on the ground. I couldn't see any sign that they moved on their own. The entire house was quiet now, except for the buzz in my ears. I stayed there, hands pressed to the floor, breathing hard. The nausea began to fade, but my body tingled. My back felt stiff. My limbs felt weak. After a few seconds, I forced myself to stand. I reached over, grabbed one of the boards, and propped it against the doorway. My hands shook so badly that I could barely position it. I picked up the hammer and slammed a nail back in. My ears rang with each hit of the hammer. The sound felt like it reverberated through my skull. I kept going until the board was secure. Then I grabbed another plank and did the same. Each hammer blow felt like it was sealing something away. When the last board was nailed back into place, I stared at it. My breath came out in ragged bursts. The living room looked the same as before, except for my footprints in the dust. I felt a small tremor under my feet, then it stopped. The walls around me seemed stable. The heavy feeling in the air started to lighten just a bit. I could still sense something behind those boards, but it wasn't pulling at me anymore. My legs wobbled as I walked to the kitchen sink to splash water on my face. The pipe squeaked when I turned the faucet, but a small trickle came out. It was cloudy, and I could smell the metallic tang of old plumbing. I cupped my hands and splashed it over my cheeks anyway. The cold water shocked my skin. It helped me focus. I grabbed my toolbox and walked back to the living room. The boards were nailed in. The door was sealed again, not perfect, but enough to keep it shut. I swallowed hard, trying to think of what to do next. Part of me wanted to run out the front door and never come back, but I had come here for a reason. I looked around the living room, feeling my heart slow down a bit. The entire house felt off, but there wasn't much time left in the day. The sun was going down outside. I could see the orange glow through the dirty windows. I had no intention of staying here overnight, not with that basement a few steps away. I grabbed a few belongings from the upstairs bedrooms. Old clothes, a couple of boxes of random items. My head was pounding the whole time. The floors upstairs seemed to vibrate slightly. The closet doors rattled when I touched them. I ignored it. I shoved the items in a duffel bag as quickly as I could and headed back downstairs. My eyes kept drifting to the boarded entrance. I kept my distance. I pulled the front door open. I didn't bother cleaning anything else. I wanted to be outside. I wanted fresh air and a clear mind. My palms were sweaty. Once I stepped onto the front porch, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease a little. The sky was turning dark and a chill wind blew across my face. I stood there staring at the old house. The windows looked empty. The boards on the hidden door remained out of sight from the outside. I knew what was under them, though. My heartbeat was still uneven and my stomach was still in knots, but I was calm enough to walk back to my car. I tossed the bag in the trunk, then got in the driver's seat. I sat for a moment, staring at the house. My hands gripped the steering wheel. I heard a dull thump somewhere inside, but it was muffled. I considered going back inside to investigate, but my body refused. I felt a dull ache in my temples. I started the engine and reversed out of the driveway. I caught one final look at the silhouette of the house before turning onto the main road. The shape looked warped in the twilight, like the house was twisting on its foundation. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The house faded into the distance, hidden by trees and shadows. My breathing was still shallow. I tasted the bitterness of fear in the back of my throat. The feeling of cold, damp air lingered in my lungs. My thoughts raced with the memory of those whispers and that rhythmic knocking. I felt an urge to return someday, to find out what was really behind those walls. But I also felt relief. I was away from that place. I told myself I wouldn't open that door again, no matter what. That sealed basement held something I couldn't explain. My only goal then was to keep driving and not look back. I remember the first time I noticed something was off. It was around 9 at night and I was about to lock my front door. I opened my mailbox on the way in and found a plain envelope. Inside it, I saw a typed letter that listed my entire day's schedule, down to the time I stopped for coffee. It ended with, "I am by your side." That single sentence made my chest feel tight. I slammed the door shut and stood there staring at the letter in my hand. It wasn't normal. It wasn't some friendly prank. That line felt too real, like someone was whispering in my ear right there in my dark living room. I didn't tell anyone right away, because I didn't know what to say. But that was how it all started. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I went to work at 8, parked in my usual spot, and walked into the office. My mind wasn't on spreadsheets or phone calls. It was stuck on that envelope. I kept imagining someone watching me, following me, writing down every move I made. During my lunch break, I went through the letter again. It detailed how I walked my dog at 6:30 a.m. It mentioned the route I took, how I paused at the corner store to check my phone, and how I scratched my head near the bus stop because I felt a bug land on me. These details were too precise. No one else would know all of that unless they had been right behind me or watching from a window. Then the last line jumped out at me again. "I am by your side." When I got home, I checked my mailbox immediately. I found another envelope. Same format, typed letter, no name, no return address. This time, it described my day at work. Every phone call I made, each meeting, the way I spilled some coffee on my tie in the break room. Then the letter ended with the same phrase. I shuddered, locked the door, and set the letter on my kitchen table. My dog Max wandered around my feet and whined, but I ignored him for a moment. I double-checked the windows and the back door, made sure everything was locked. It felt like someone could burst in at any second. I tossed and turned all night. The room felt hot, and I couldn't keep my eyes closed for more than a few minutes. Every sound in the house made me jump. By dawn, I got up and paced around the living room. I checked outside through the blinds. Nothing stood out. The street was empty. I told myself it could be a stalker or some weirdo with too much free time. I tried to think of any ex-partner or former friend who might do this, but no one came to mind. I felt uneasy, like I was missing a big piece of information. Over the next few days, the letters kept coming. I tried staying away from my house longer, thinking I could break whatever routine the sender expected. It didn't matter. The letters always arrived, each one describing how my day went, even when I changed my schedule. I walked a different path to work. I chose a different cafe. Still, the letters matched everything I did. My gut tightened every time I opened a new envelope. I started to sweat just seeing the mailbox. The final line, "I am by your side," made my skin crawl. I decided to look for any signs of forced entry around my property. One evening, I walked around the house with a flashlight. I inspected the windows and the outer walls. That's when I saw something odd near my living room window, a handprint. It was faint, but it looked like someone pressed their palm against the glass. I tried to wipe it away. My hand shook a bit. The next day, there was another handprint, this time on the wall near my bedroom window. It didn't make sense because that spot was around 10 feet off the ground. There was nothing to climb on. I couldn't figure out how anyone would reach that high without a ladder. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I stared up at that mark. It looked fresh, and the shape was bigger than my own hand. It didn't look like a casual smudge. I called the police, but they wrote it off as trespassing or a possible prank. An officer walked around, checked for footprints, took some notes, and left. Nothing changed after that. The letters continued. The handprints appeared in new places, sometimes on my bedroom window, sometimes on the inside of my garage door. I started to wonder if I was sleeping too heavily, missing someone sneaking around at night. But that didn't feel right. I never found footprints or broken locks. Then the letters began talking about things that hadn't happened yet. One letter mentioned I would spill coffee on my shirt before noon the next day. I thought it was some twisted guess, so I made sure to be extra careful at work. I avoided the break room coffee machine and drank from a bottle of water I'd brought from home. But around 10 in the morning, a co-worker bumped into me in the hallway, and I dropped my water bottle. It splashed all over my shirt, staining it and leaving me soaked. I stared at the wet spot, thinking about the letter's words. They had gotten that detail right, down to the time. My chest felt cold, and I could hardly focus the rest of the day. 2 days later, another letter mentioned an argument I was going to have with a friend over the phone. Sure enough, that night, a friend called me, and we got into a stupid fight about something that normally wouldn't bother me. The letter's words played in my mind the entire time we were arguing, like it was nudging me toward that outcome. After we hung up, I was covered in sweat. I dropped my phone on the couch and sat there breathing hard. I wanted to rip those letters into pieces, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I kept them in a drawer in my bedroom, trying to see if there was some pattern or code. Each time I read them, I felt sick. I started waking up in the middle of the night, certain I heard footsteps in the hallway, but the house would be silent. I got a security camera and placed it in my living room. I set up motion detectors near the back door. It didn't help. The next morning, another letter arrived saying, "Your camera won't show me, I am by your side." I tore the paper and threw it on the ground. My hands were trembling, and I had a lump in my throat. I knew something was in my house, or near it, or maybe on the walls, but I couldn't prove it. My frustration turned into paranoia. I stopped inviting friends over, worried they might become part of this nightmare. I spent my evenings crouched by the windows, watching my yard for any movement. More handprints kept showing up. Sometimes they were at angles that didn't make sense, like on the ceiling of my porch. I once climbed a ladder to see if they were real. They were. I put my palm over the print, and it was a different size, maybe larger than mine by half an inch. I wiped my face and felt tears at the corner of my eyes. I hated feeling so helpless. One night I heard a rustling sound near the mailbox. I jumped up, ran to the door, and yanked it open. The mailbox was empty, but the flag was up. I reached inside and pulled out an envelope. My skin prickled as I opened it under the porch light. The letter said, "Right now your heart is racing. Check your bathroom mirror." I froze. My bathroom was down the hall behind me. I took a few steps back inside, every inch of my body tense. I wanted to ignore it, but I knew I had to look. When I flipped on the bathroom light, I saw a fresh handprint on the mirror, right at face level. My reflection was distorted around that handprint. I stumbled back, slammed the door, and leaned against the wall, breathing like I'd run a mile. I couldn't sleep after that. I kept all the lights on. I sat on the couch, holding a baseball bat. My dog, Max, stayed close to me, ears perked, but he never barked. It was like he couldn't sense anything unusual. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a faint creak on the porch. I held my breath. I didn't move. After a few minutes, it went quiet. I forced myself to check outside, but I saw nothing except an empty street and the dark shape of a tree near the sidewalk. Things got worse when the letters started predicting bigger events. They described changes at my job, telling me I would get a new project assigned before the end of the week. It happened exactly as stated. They mentioned a neighbor who would knock on my door in the middle of the night because of a water leak. That happened too. Every little detail matched reality. I felt like I was trapped in someone else's script. My life wasn't my own anymore. One evening, I tried to write a reply. I took a piece of paper and wrote, "Who are you? Why are you doing this? Leave me alone." I stuck it in the mailbox. The next day, I got a response. "You know me. I am by your side." That felt like a punch to the gut. I didn't recognize the handwriting because it was always typed, but the message was clear. Whoever it was knew everything about me. I started checking into the history of my house. I went to the local records office, looked up old residents, previous incidents, anything that might link to weird activity. There were no suspicious events, no legends, no stories about ghosts or hauntings. The house itself wasn't that old, built in the 80s. I spoke to the neighbors, but nobody had seen anything strange and no one else was getting these letters. It was just me. They looked at me like I was an anxious wreck, and maybe I was. My eyes were rimmed with shadows from lack of sleep. I tried to calm down, but every day felt like a countdown to the next letter. I began to notice something unsettling. The letters seemed to anticipate my reactions. One morning I was too scared to check the mailbox right away, so I waited until lunch. But as soon as I pulled out the envelope, I saw the first line. "You delayed checking this until noon. I watched you pace by the window." I nearly dropped the paper. I whipped my head around, scanning every window on my block. Nobody was outside. I felt a chill along my arms. Could they see me now? Were they in a parked car or behind a curtain in a nearby house? I tried to get a friend to stay over one night, but I couldn't explain everything without sounding out of my mind. I only said I'd been feeling uneasy and wanted company. My friend stayed in the guest room. Around midnight, I heard him get up to use the bathroom. After a few minutes, he called my name. I rushed over and found him looking at a new handprint on the bathroom mirror, similar to the one I'd seen before, but this time it had a streak down the center, like a dragged finger. My friend looked freaked out. He kept asking if I was playing a prank. I swore I wasn't. We spent the rest of the night in the living room, trying to watch TV, ignoring the tension in the air. In the morning, he left in a hurry. He didn't say much, and I didn't blame him. After that, the letters started showing up more often, sometimes twice a day. They mentioned my friend's visit. They mentioned the exact conversation we had in the living room. They ended with the same line. I felt like I was losing control of everything. My chest felt heavy all the time. At work, my productivity crashed because I couldn't think straight. My boss gave me a concerned look, but I didn't know how to explain. There was no logic to any of it. A normal stalker couldn't predict events with this level of detail, and a normal person couldn't leave handprints in places that seemed impossible to reach. One night, I decided I couldn't keep living like that. I packed a bag and drove to a nearby hotel. I paid for a week, thinking I would break the cycle. For 2 days, I didn't check my mail and I didn't go home. I tried to relax in the hotel room, ordering takeout and leaving the TV on for background noise. But on the second night, the front desk called me. They said there was a letter waiting for me in the lobby. My stomach dropped. I went downstairs and sure enough, the same type of envelope was there, no return address. I tore it open on the spot. "You can't run from me," it read. "Check your car windshield." I ran outside to the parking lot, nearly slipping on the wet pavement. My car was parked under a street lamp. On the windshield, there was a single handprint, right where a driver would see it from the inside. I hurried to the car and opened the door, but nothing else was there, just that eerie mark. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the beginnings of a headache. I got back inside the hotel and locked myself in my room. Now I'm back home. I don't have a choice. The letters come no matter where I go. I can't explain it. I can't see who's behind it. My windows and doors remain locked, but the handprints keep appearing. My body is tense all the time. My heartbeat feels loud in my ears whenever I walk near the mailbox. Each letter reveals my future actions, as if I'm just a passenger in my own life. My phone sits next to me, but I don't want to call the police again. They can't help. I sense that whatever is doing this isn't normal. I haven't been outside in days except to get groceries or check the mail. I keep hoping the letters will stop or the handprints will fade away, but they don't. Sometimes I feel pressure in the air beside me, like someone is breathing on my neck. I can't see them, but I feel certain they're standing there just out of my sight. Every light in the house is on, yet the corners still look dark. Today, a new letter arrived. It was short. Only one sentence. "Something will happen at midnight." I glanced at the clock. It's 11:47 now. I'm writing this at my kitchen table, trying to stay calm. I hear a faint tapping on the window behind me, but I'm not turning around. My palms are sweating. My vision is a bit blurry. There's a coldness in the room, and I can't tell if it's a draft or something else. Midnight is coming. I'm waiting, bracing myself for whatever is out there. I don't know what will happen when the clock strikes 12, but I know I'm not alone. And no matter what I do, that presence will stay with me. It said so, over and over again. I am by your side. I got out of my car and felt a deep rush of relief. My chest felt light for the first time in months. I had left the city behind me. The cabin stood a few yards away, surrounded by tall pines. The roof looked a bit worn, and the walls had a dull brown color. It didn't look cozy, but it felt isolated, which was exactly what I wanted. I just wanted peace. My eyes took a quick scan of the area, and I didn't see any other houses around. I heard birds somewhere deeper in the forest, but their calls sounded faint. I felt a breeze that chilled the back of my neck. I wondered if I had made a mistake, but I still walked forward. I pushed the front door open after fiddling with the old key the rental office had given me. The hinge creaked, and I smelled a stale odor like damp wood. I noticed the place had one main room with a small kitchenette on the side. There was a narrow hallway leading to a bedroom and a bathroom. The walls looked pretty bare. The floor had scratches and a few stains. I put my bag down and stepped around to get a feel for the layout. My first real concern popped up when I saw something strange on the wall near the kitchen. It looked like a dark blotch about the size of my palm. At first I thought it was just a patch of mold or dirt. It had no distinct shape. It was just a messy area of darkness. I leaned closer and sniffed. I didn't smell anything. I reached out to touch it. My fingertips grazed the surface. It felt smooth, almost slick, but when I lifted my hand, there was nothing on my skin. That felt off, but I decided I'd ignore it for now. I had come here to relax, not to obsess over a wall stain. I put a few groceries in the fridge, then set up my sleeping bag in the bedroom. A few hours later, I sat on the front porch with a folding chair. I listened to the wind pushing through the trees. I could see thick clusters of branches shifting and clacking against each other. My mind drifted and I started to doze. Then I felt a prickling on my neck, like someone was watching me. I turned around. No one was there. I heard the cabin creak. Wood can shift when the temperature changes, so I tried to brush it off. But something about that sound made me uneasy. I got up and decided to walk around the cabin once, just to clear my head. While circling the cabin, I spotted more dark stains on the outside wall. They were smaller, scattered around the backside of the building. They looked a bit like water damage. I wanted to ignore them, but the shapes seemed oddly deliberate. They weren't uniform, though. Some were round, others had spiky edges. My stomach felt tight. I reminded myself that old cabins have flaws. That's normal. I forced myself to keep going, completing the lap around the building. Then I went back inside. I spent the rest of the evening trying to relax. I opened a can of soup, heated it on the small stovetop, and ate in silence. The cabin felt quiet. I could hear my own chewing. I could hear my own breathing. Then I noticed a faint buzz in my ears. My heart picked up speed. I pressed my hands over my ears. The buzzing stopped for a moment, then returned. It wasn't loud, but it was annoying. I thought it might be tinnitus, maybe from stress. I tried to dismiss it. After dinner, I switched on a small lamp by the couch in the main room. I planned to read a paperback I'd brought, but my eyes kept going back to that weird dark blotch on the kitchen wall. It seemed bigger now, maybe by a couple of inches. My breathing grew faster. I stood up and walked over. I leaned in again. This time, my skin tingled. I got the impression that the blotch was shifting. It almost pulsed. I rubbed my eyes. I considered the possibility that the dim lamplight was playing tricks. I stared at it for a while, but it stayed still after that. I exhaled. I went back to the couch, trying to stay calm. When it was time to sleep, I went to the bedroom. I turned on the small overhead light and saw more of those stains near the closet door. My forehead tensed. These stains were smaller, but they had the same dark quality. I thought about calling the rental office to complain. But it was late and I didn't feel like driving out to find a phone signal. The listing had mentioned that cell reception might be poor in the area. I decided to wait until morning. My first night there was rough. The bed was lumpy and the cabin felt too still. Around midnight, I woke up to a soft whispering sound. I sat up. My heart pounded. The whisper seemed to come from the walls. It was faint, not in English or any language I recognized. It was more like a hiss with occasional pops of quiet clicking. I held my breath. My throat felt tight. Then it stopped. I listened for a long time. I only heard my own heartbeat in my ears. Eventually, I dozed off again. But I was uneasy. The next morning, I woke up with a headache. I stumbled out of bed, stepped into the main room, and flicked on the light. I saw that the blotch near the kitchen was now twice the size it had been the night before. My eyes darted across the walls. There were now several new spots, smaller, but definitely visible. My stomach churned. I blinked a few times, hoping I was seeing things. But the stains stayed put. I thought about driving back into town immediately. But I remembered how much I wanted this break. So I tried to come up with a logical reason for these stains. Maybe there was a leaking roof. Maybe some strange mold. I told myself I would go out to get supplies, return, and try to clean it. I kept thinking I could fix it or cover it. I got into my car and drove about 20 minutes along the dirt road until I found a small convenience store. I bought bleach, rubber gloves, and a sponge. I also grabbed some more food and water. The store clerk made small talk, asked if I was staying in that old cabin. I nodded. She gave me a weird look, but didn't say much else. I felt a twinge of paranoia, like maybe she knew something she wasn't telling me. I hurried out, got back into the car, and drove back. By midday, I stood in front of the largest blotch in the main room. I put on the gloves, soaked the sponge with bleach solution, and pressed it to the wall. At first, I just heard the sponge squeaking. Then I heard a soft hiss, almost like a low whisper. My hands froze. I felt a shiver run up my arms. My chest felt tight, but I forced myself to keep scrubbing. I noticed the bleach water sliding down the wall in thin streams. The dark stain didn't lighten. It stayed the same color. After a few minutes, my arms were shaking and the stain looked unchanged. I gave up. I pressed my ear to the wall and listened. There was a faint throbbing sound like a heartbeat. That made me jump back. I dropped the sponge and it landed with a wet thud. I stood there breathing fast. I decided to take a break. I walked outside and went around the back of the cabin to see if any water leaks were visible. I didn't see anything obvious. The roof looked intact, but I spotted more dark patches along the back wall. They seemed to spread in a jagged line, almost forming an uneven path toward the forest. My hands felt clammy. The air smelled heavier, like rotting leaves. My head started to ache. I glanced into the forest and saw that the tree bark on several trunks was darker than before. I felt certain that something was spreading. My breathing grew shallow and I needed a moment to steady myself. I spent the afternoon pacing around the cabin, opening windows and trying to get fresh air. The whispering noises came and went. Sometimes they sounded like they were right next to me. Other times they were barely audible. My body felt exhausted. My muscles were tense and my head throbbed. Around sunset, I went back to the bedroom. I saw that the stains around the closet door had grown. A few of them had expanded from palm size to about the size of a dinner plate. I stood there staring, feeling panic rise in my chest. Suddenly, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned. In the darkness of one of the larger stains, I saw a shape. It looked like a shadow or silhouette. It was human-like in outline, but it swayed in a slow, unsteady motion. I let out a gasp and stumbled backward. My back hit the wall behind me and my heart raced. For a moment, I couldn't move. I blinked hard, trying to see if my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the shape stayed there, still swaying, until it sank deeper into the dark stain and disappeared. I wiped sweat from my forehead. My hands were shaking. My throat felt dry and I could barely swallow. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with mold or dampness. Something else was in the cabin. Something was coming through the walls. I had a tightness in my chest. My mind raced with thoughts of leaving right away, but I also felt a strange pull. It was like the stains had a presence that made it hard to think straight. That night, I avoided the bedroom. I sat in the main room with all the lights on. I kept a flashlight by my side. I tried to keep my eyes off the walls, but I could see the stains growing in my peripheral vision. The cabin felt cramped. The air felt stale, and I could smell that damp odor again, but stronger. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. The whispering sounds started again, louder than before. They seemed to come from every corner. My skin broke out in goosebumps. I felt dizzy. I tried to speak out loud, to tell whatever was there to leave me alone, but my voice came out shaky and weak. At some point, I thought I saw something move across the floor. It was a dark patch about the size of a large cat. It slid along the floorboards near my feet. I jumped up and pointed the flashlight at it. I saw a slow, shifting ripple like liquid shadow. Then it vanished under the couch. I heard a scraping sound, and the couch moved an inch on its own. My chest hammered. I circled around, shining the flashlight. But the patch was gone. I felt sweat rolling down my temple. I started to question my sanity. I couldn't handle staying in that room, so I grabbed my keys and stepped outside. It was late at night. The moonlight gave me enough light to see the outline of the trees. The forest looked darker than before, like the canopy had become thicker. I heard quiet rustling noises from the undergrowth. I spotted more of those dark patches on the ground, as if they had leaked out of the cabin. They looked almost wet. I knelt down and poked one gently with a stick. The stick sank in a few inches, then came out covered in some black goo that dripped thickly. I threw the stick aside. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. A faint whisper seemed to come from the patch itself, a gentle hiss that rose and fell. When I looked back at the cabin, I saw dark streaks on the windows. They ran down the glass like greasy marks. I felt a wave of panic surge in my chest. I started to think about driving away, but the idea of leaving my stuff behind frustrated me. Yet I could feel the dread building. My hands shook as I took a few cautious steps toward my car. Then I heard a whisper by my feet. It sounded like a voice. I couldn't understand the words, but it felt close. I froze for a few seconds. I pointed my flashlight down, but I only saw pine needles and dirt. I rushed to my car, opened the door, and sat behind the wheel. I tried the ignition. The engine turned, then sputtered. On the second try, it started. My headlights cut through the darkness. I stayed there, not sure what to do. My pulse pounded. I rested my head on the steering wheel, breathing hard. After a while, I felt a little calmer. The idea of spending another night in that cabin made my skin crawl, but a stubborn part of me wanted to try to make sense of it. Finally, I grabbed a blanket from the trunk and decided to sleep in the car. I locked the doors. I leaned my seat back, turned off the engine to save fuel, and tried to rest. The forest around me was quiet, but I sensed movement in the shadows. I kept the flashlight within reach. Every so often, I heard those whispers. It was like they wanted me to come back inside. My heart kept pounding, and my throat was dry, but I forced myself to stay put in the car. I dozed off for maybe an hour, then woke up to a slow, scraping noise near the passenger door. I snapped upright, grabbed the flashlight, and shone it through the window. I saw dark streaks crawling across the glass. They spread in branching lines, moving steadily. My body tensed. My mouth went dry. I started the engine again and turned on the headlights. I saw black spots slithering along the ground, connecting the cabin to my car. They looked like living stains. I felt a strong urge to drive away, but the path out was dark, and I wasn't sure I'd make it through the winding road safely at night. I felt trapped. I sat there, headlights on, and watched these black patches creep closer. I heard a distinct whisper. It sounded like it came from the back seat. I spun around, shining the flashlight, but nothing was there. My body was rigid. I could barely breathe. My mind felt scattered. I tried to remind myself of reality. This was just a cabin, just a forest. But the evidence of my own eyes was too strong. Something was leaking into this world through those stains. Something wanted to reach me. For the rest of that night, I stayed awake. The dark patches surrounded the car at times, then retreated. I heard the cabin's walls creak. The wind made the trees sway, and I felt an odd vibration under the car, like the ground was shifting. My shoulders were stiff, and my back ached from the seat. I couldn't force myself to leave. My head pounded. By dawn, the stains around my car had melted back toward the cabin walls. They left smears along the dirt, forming a trail that vanished at the threshold. That's when I decided I would pack up and go. I felt shaky, but I knew I couldn't stay another day. I started the car again, let the engine run, and watched the sun rise through the pines. Then I made a quick dash inside, grabbed my most important things, and tossed them in the back seat. As I hurried, I saw that the stains in the main room had spread across the entire wall. I heard rustling and whispering behind me, but I refused to look. My heart was in my throat. I nearly tripped on the doorstep on my way out. Once I had my essentials, I jumped into the car, slammed the door, and drove off. I kept checking the rearview mirror as I left. The cabin disappeared behind the trees after a short distance. For a moment, I thought I saw dark shapes slithering after me, but they fell back as I pressed the gas pedal. My hands gripped the wheel so tight that my knuckles turned white. I felt a cold sweat on my skin. The tension in my shoulders made my neck hurt, but I just kept driving until the road joined the main highway. I didn't look back again. I didn't stop. And I still feel that cabin's pull whenever I think about it, but I'll never go back. I never thought I'd hear a voice that wasn't mine. I never imagined I'd find myself in unfamiliar rooms with no memory of walking into them. But one night I snapped awake on a cold bathroom floor and realized my life wasn't what I thought it was. I felt an ache in my left arm. I heard a steady drip in the sink, and I noticed the flickering light above me. My own reflection in the mirror looked wrong, like I was seeing a stranger's face. That was the first sign that something else was trying to take control. I had no idea how bad it would get or how far it would go, but it went beyond anything I'd ever feared. It was in my head. It felt real, and it wanted me to give in. My name is Eric. I work as a freelance graphic designer, and I live alone in a small one-bedroom apartment downtown. My place is usually quiet, with the hum of the fridge and the distant traffic noise outside. That's it. I do my work on a laptop, watch a few shows at night, and occasionally meet up with a couple of friends for drinks. I wouldn't say my life was exciting, but it was comfortable. Then, a couple of weeks ago, I started having these gaps in my memory. The first time it happened, I woke up at my desk. I saw that my notepad had scribbles all over it. My hand was cramping, as if I'd been writing for hours. The writing was messy and didn't look like my usual handwriting. I couldn't recognize the words. They seemed like half-formed sentences with letters missing. Some lines had shapes that looked like small circles with diagonal slashes. I felt confused, but I brushed it off and assumed I'd drifted off while doodling. That night, my head hurt, and I went to bed early. A few days later, I woke up in my bedroom with no idea how I got there. The last thing I remembered was watching a documentary on my couch. I didn't recall walking to my bed or turning off the TV. My phone was on the floor by the door, and I had no idea why it was there. My heart started racing, and my palms got sweaty. I stood up and looked around, trying to see if anything else seemed off. I noticed my bedroom window was half open, even though I never leave it open at night. My blinds were moving slightly in the breeze, and I heard city sounds coming through the gap. I got a chill then, and it wasn't from the breeze. It felt like someone had been in my room, or maybe I had wandered around in some kind of blackout. I began to worry that I was overworked. I told myself it was just stress or poor sleep. I convinced myself it was harmless. But the next time it happened, there was a voice involved. I was in the kitchen making coffee. It was early morning. As I reached for the mug in the cabinet, I heard a whisper in my ear. It said something that sounded like my name, but the voice was harsh and raspy. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me. My heart hammered in my chest. There was nobody there. I stood still, breathing hard, and looked down at my phone to check the time. I realized I couldn't remember if I had started the coffee maker or not. The machine was on, the hot plate was warm, and I smelled coffee, but I had no memory of pressing the button. That afternoon, I sat at my desk and tried to get some work done. My mind was all over the place. My hands shook a bit when I tried to move the mouse. Every sound outside felt too loud, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. I had this sensation that someone was watching me. I tried to focus on a client's logo design, but my eyes kept drifting to the notepad next to me. I saw fresh marks on the paper, like someone had pressed a pen into the page over and over, creating small punctures in the shape of those same strange circles and slashes. My stomach lurched. I had no memory of making those marks. That night, I decided to lock my bedroom door from the inside. My thought process was simple. If I was sleepwalking or something like that, a locked door would keep me in one place. I pulled my desk chair closer to the door so I could brace it. Before lying down, I checked my windows, made sure they were shut and latched. Then I crawled into bed. I remember staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding, wondering if I would snap awake on the couch or in some random hallway. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. When I opened my eyes, I was in a different room, but not any room in my apartment. It looked like a storage space or a janitor's closet. I saw shelves filled with old cleaning supplies and boxes of paper towels. A single overhead bulb flickered. It made a faint buzzing noise, and I could smell bleach. My first thought was that I was having a nightmare, but then I pinched my arm. It hurt. I felt the pain, plain and simple. I got up, nearly tipping over a mop bucket. My muscles were stiff. I saw a wooden door with a metal handle, so I tried it, but it was locked. I felt a surge of panic in my chest. I stood there breathing hard and trying not to freak out. Then I heard the voice. It was right behind me, but I couldn't see anyone. It was the same raspy tone I'd heard in my kitchen. It spoke a few words, but they were garbled. My knees felt weak, and I backed up against the shelves, jostling a bag of sponges. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice echoing. No one answered. The door handle rattled, and I froze. I pressed my back against the wall, holding my breath. Then everything went dark, like someone hit a switch in my brain. Next thing I knew, I was in my bed again, soaked in sweat. My door was still locked, and the chair was still braced against it. I grabbed my phone to look at the time. It was 4 a.m. I sat there in bed, gasping for air. I had no idea if I'd dreamed the whole sequence or if it had actually happened. My legs felt like I'd been running. My arms were sore. I turned on the lamp and checked my phone for any calls or messages. There was nothing. I felt sick to my stomach. My head started pounding. The next day, I couldn't focus on work. I tried to design a few mock-ups, but my mind kept drifting to the memory of that storage closet. Was I going insane? Was something messing with me? I paced around my living room, checking every corner, every closet, every cabinet. I found no signs of break-ins or anything strange. But later, when I opened my notepad on the kitchen counter, I saw more weird scribbles. This time it was a phrase in my own handwriting, but I didn't remember writing it. It said, "I am here." My hand went cold when I read that. I slammed the notepad shut and tossed it into a drawer. My breath was shaky and my head started spinning again. I felt that voice somewhere inside me, like it was waiting to speak. As days passed, I noticed small objects going missing. My keys would vanish, then reappear under my sink. My wallet showed up on top of my fridge once, which made no sense. At night, I heard footsteps in my living room, even though I was alone. Sometimes, I caught the faint smell of something metallic, but I couldn't pinpoint its source. I felt disconnected from reality. My hands trembled whenever I tried to hold my phone. My appetite vanished. I forced myself to eat a sandwich for dinner, but I could barely taste it. One afternoon, I decided to record myself. I set up my laptop camera in the living room, aiming it at my couch. I let it run for hours while I pretended to watch TV. Eventually, I drifted off. When I woke up, I felt disoriented again, and the room was dark. My mouth felt dry and my arms tingled. I switched on a lamp and checked the laptop. It was still recording. The battery was nearly dead, but I stopped the recording and replayed the footage. At first, I saw myself sitting there, eyes slowly drooping until I fell asleep. Then, after about 20 minutes, I saw my body jolt upright. My eyes were open, but they didn't look normal. They seemed unfocused, staring straight ahead. I watched in shock as I stood up, walked off camera, then came back holding a piece of paper. I sat down at the coffee table and started drawing. The angle wasn't great, but I saw my hand moving rapidly, almost frantically. Then I stood up, tore the paper in half, and walked out of view. The footage stopped a few minutes later when the battery died. My hands were shaking as I closed the file. I searched my living room for any pieces of paper. I found nothing. I checked the trash can. It was empty. I opened every drawer and cabinet. I didn't see any torn paper or any new drawings. I felt like I was losing my mind. Something was taking over my body. It felt like I was being possessed by a presence I couldn't name. I tried to steady my breathing and tell myself it wasn't real, but then I heard that voice in my head again. It said my name, clear as day. Eric. I jumped and nearly dropped my laptop. The voice wasn't loud, but it seemed to come from inside my skull. I sat down on the couch and stared at the wall, breathing hard. My forehead was slick with sweat. My legs felt weak. I tried to tell the voice to leave me alone. I said, "Get out of my head," under my breath. The voice whispered something else, but I couldn't catch the words. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. I leaned forward, trying not to vomit. That night I couldn't sleep at all. I sat in bed with the lights on, hugging my knees. My head was pounding and my eyes were burning. Around midnight, I heard that voice again, calling me from the living room. I got up, heart hammering, and stepped into the hallway. The living room was dark except for the faint glow of the city lights through the window. I saw my laptop on the coffee table and the screen was on, which was strange because I'd shut it down earlier. I crept closer. My entire body was tense. My muscles ached from stress. On the screen there was a text file open. The text read, "Let me in." I stood there in silence, my hands shaking. I felt my throat tighten. My pulse pounded in my ears. I reached for the laptop, but the screen went black before I could touch it. The air felt thick and heavy. I backed away and knocked over a glass on the coffee table. It hit the floor with a loud clank, but didn't break. I left it there and stumbled back into my bedroom, slamming the door. I felt caged. My own apartment no longer felt safe. That presence was in my head, and it was influencing my body. I had no idea what it wanted or how far it would push me. I only knew I was losing control, and I hated it. Over the next few days, I started avoiding sleep. I chugged energy drinks and coffee, trying to stay alert. I kept my laptop shut and used my phone to check emails. Sometimes the voice would whisper when I was in the shower. Sometimes I'd feel a strange pressure in my skull when I was washing dishes or brushing my teeth. My eyes were sunken, and my skin looked pale. I didn't want to leave my apartment, but I also didn't feel safe inside it. One morning, I noticed a bruise on my left shoulder. It was shaped like a handprint, but my own hand didn't match the size of the mark. I tried talking to a friend over the phone, but I didn't tell him everything. I just said I wasn't feeling well. He offered to come by, but I made up an excuse about needing to rest. Part of me was afraid that if someone else came here, something terrible would happen. Another part of me worried I'd lose control in front of him. So I stayed alone, pacing my living room, checking every corner. My night table started shaking sometimes, even when I wasn't touching it. Lights flickered. The voice grew stronger. Now I'm stuck in this cycle of confusion and terror. Every so often I'll come to my senses in a place I don't recognize. Sometimes it's just the hallway of my apartment building. Sometimes it's a friend's parking lot. Once, it was the basement laundry room in my building. Each time I feel a cold sweat on my neck. My heart pounds in my chest. My clothes stick to my skin, and the air around me feels stale. It's like I'm stepping into a scene that's halfway done and I have no idea how I got there. My phone usually has no signal in these moments, or the battery is drained. When I come back to my apartment, I check for more scribbles, more notes, and I usually find them. A few nights ago, I finally lost it. I heard the voice calling me from the bathroom. It said, "Look." I was in the living room at the time, breathing hard, feeling cornered. I decided to confront it, whatever it was. I walked to the bathroom door, opened it, and turned on the light. My reflection was there in the mirror. I saw my eyes wide and bloodshot. My jaw was clenched. Then I noticed someone had written on the mirror with what looked like black eyeliner. It said, "I'm waiting." My chest tightened. My mouth went dry. I checked my medicine cabinet for the eyeliner, but I don't even own any. I slammed the cabinet shut. My reflection stared back at me, but it looked off like my expression lagged. I blinked hard and stepped back. Then the bathroom light flickered, and for a split second I saw a shape behind me. My throat closed up, and I scrambled out of there, shutting the door behind me. I haven't opened that door since. I can't bring myself to look in that mirror again. I'm typing this on my phone, sitting against my locked bedroom door. I know the voice is still in my head. I feel it. It's like a constant low buzz that sometimes spikes into a cold demand. The scribbles in my notepad have turned into messages I can read now, messages that say, "Submit," or "Join me." I've tried throwing the notepad away, but it appears again on my desk or on my couch cushions. It's always there, even when I'm sure I've put it outside in the trash chute. I don't have any explanation for what's happening. I only know that I'm losing my hold on my own life. Every time I blink, I wonder if I'll open my eyes somewhere else. Every time I hear a noise, I wonder if it's the voice or my own thoughts. I keep waiting for an answer or a clue about what it wants. I feel like I'm trapped in a nightmare I can't escape, and there's nowhere to run. The presence is inside me and I can't shut it out. If I can't find a way to stop it, I'm afraid I'll disappear completely and it'll take my place. That's the truth of it. That's what's happening to me. I'm sitting here typing these words, hoping that by writing them down I can keep my mind focused. I feel my body trembling, and I hear a noise at the other end of my apartment. It might be the voice, or it might be just the building settling. I can't tell anymore. My stomach is twisted in knots and my mouth tastes sour. I'm not sure how much longer I can hold on, but I need to keep going. I need to stay awake. Maybe if I don't sleep, it can't take me. Or maybe I'm wrong about that too. I don't know. All I can do is wait and hope it doesn't destroy me completely. And that's where I'll end this for now. I got to this town after a long drive. I don't want to say the town's name out loud because it still gives me a strange feeling. All I'll say is that there's a lake in the center, and the mountains around it look more like walls than anything scenic. Right away, I noticed the silence. There was no regular noise of people talking or cars passing. It was just still air and the soft clatter of tree branches when the wind picked up. That silence felt heavy in my chest. It made me alert in a way I couldn't explain. I rented a small house on the edge of a gravel road. The realtor handed me a key, gave me a short nod, and walked away without saying much. I stood there in front of the house, waiting to see if he would at least say goodbye or good luck. He didn't. He got in his car, drove off, and left me on a porch that felt strangely cold. I remember thinking, well, it's a new start. Maybe it just takes time to adjust. When I first unlocked the door, I smelled dust and damp wood. The living room was empty except for an old chair in the corner. I walked through the small kitchen, the single bedroom, and a tiny bathroom at the back. The house was simple and a bit run down, but I'd lived in worse places. I set my bags down in the bedroom and opened the windows to get some fresh air. As I stood by the window, I noticed a row of houses across the road. Their windows were shut and I couldn't see movement, but I had the impression there were people inside. Hard to explain, like something was blocking my view from the inside. That night, I tried to relax after the long drive. I tried to close my eyes and just focus on my breathing. I turned on the single overhead light in the living room and sat on the old chair with a bottle of water. The walls felt too close, and the silence outside made the ticking of my watch sound louder than normal. A few hours later, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. It sounded like several pairs of shoes crunching stones. I got up and looked out the window, but there was no one there. The sound stopped. I stood in the dark for a moment, feeling my heartbeat in my ears. I waited, but there was nothing else. I told myself it was the wind or some loose stones rolling around. The next day, I went out to see the lake. The walk took me about 15 minutes down a narrow road that wound between large pines. I saw only 2 cars parked near the entrance to the lakeside path. There were no signs of people, though. I glanced around, expecting at least a couple of fishermen or maybe someone walking a dog. But it was empty. The water was dark and still. The mountains around the lake created a ring that made me feel trapped. I stood on the shore and thought about my plans. I was there to find a quiet place and maybe do some freelance work without distractions. It seemed like I'd found the quiet part, but it was a bit too quiet. On my way back, I noticed a gray wooden house close to the path. It looked like it had brand new curtains and the windows were open. I thought I heard a faint voice coming from inside, like someone talking on the phone. I stopped for a second to listen, but all I caught were a few words. "He's here." That made me uneasy. I wasn't sure if they were talking about me or if it was a coincidence. When I stepped closer to see if I could find a door or a nameplate, the window slammed shut. The force of it made a loud bang that echoed. I stepped back, feeling a jolt in my chest, and decided to keep walking. Back in my rental house, I tried to stay calm. I cooked a quick meal on the old stove, then sat on the porch. The sky was overcast and the temperature was dropping. Across the road, I saw a faint light in one of the houses. The door opened for a second, but I didn't see anyone come out. The door just shut again. The place was too still. No streetlights, no hum of electricity, nothing. My ears started picking up every little noise. The wind in the trees, my own breathing, the porch creaking under my weight. That night I had trouble sleeping. Around midnight, I heard a door creak open somewhere in the dark. It didn't sound like it was inside my house, more like the neighbor's place. A few moments later, I heard slow footsteps on a wooden floor. Then a sudden thump, like someone dropped something heavy. I stared at the ceiling, hoping it would stop, but the sounds kept going for a while. Footsteps, a scraping noise, and then silence. My heart was racing. I wasn't sure if I should go outside or just ignore it. I stayed in bed feeling sweaty, my pulse pounding in my ears. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. I decided to go to the only diner in town, hoping I'd see some locals and maybe get a sense of what was going on. The diner had a flickering neon sign that said open, but the inside looked deserted. A single waitress stood behind the counter, wiping a glass. She didn't smile or say hello. I walked up to the counter and asked for a coffee. She poured it and slid the cup over to me. I asked if there were many people in town. She shrugged and said, "Depends on the day." Then she walked to the kitchen and stayed there. I sat in that empty diner for a while, sipping my coffee and staring at the empty booths. A moment later, I heard a man's voice behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. The voice said my name. Not the one I'd introduced myself with, but a nickname only a few people knew from my childhood. It made my skin crawl. I got up, placed some money on the counter, and left without finishing my coffee. Outside, the sky was gray again, and the air smelled like rain. I walked around the block, passing a few closed shops. In the windows, I saw dusty shelves and old signs. I noticed footprints on the sidewalk as if someone had walked there recently, but no actual people around. Every so often, I caught a glimpse of something moving behind a curtain or a shape in a doorway, but when I looked directly at it, there was nothing. Back at my rental house, the air inside felt stale. I opened the windows to let in some breeze. Across the street, I saw a dark figure standing at a window. It was definitely a person's shape, but I couldn't make out any details. They stood there, watching me. My heart beat faster. I lifted a hand almost to wave. but the figure moved away in a quick, jerky motion. I closed my window, feeling a chill run through my spine. For the next few days, it got stranger. Every night around midnight, I heard sounds from the neighboring houses. Doors closing, floors creaking, sometimes what sounded like soft conversations. I started pacing my living room, trying to decide if I should knock on a neighbor's door. But each time I felt this heavy dread, like something was telling me to stay inside. My nerves were shot. I jumped at every little noise. I slept with the lights on, dozing off for a few minutes at a time, then waking up in a sweat because I heard a floorboard creak somewhere in the house. One afternoon, I forced myself to go back to the lake. I needed some fresh air and a chance to see if there was any sign of regular activity. The path was still empty. I didn't see any cars or people along the way. At the shore, I noticed footprints in the wet sand. They were fresh, leading along the water's edge. I decided to follow them. After a few yards, the footprints just stopped, like whoever made them vanished. There wasn't even a sign of them turning back. My heart pounded and I rubbed my arms, realizing I was shaking. I hurried away, feeling an urge to run. That night, I sat in my living room again. I didn't bother trying to sleep early anymore. I kept the lights on and stared at my phone, considering calling someone, but I didn't know who to call or what to say. Around midnight, the sounds started again, but this time they were louder and closer. I heard footsteps on my own porch. The wood creaked under the weight of somebody walking right up to my door. I turned off the light, holding my breath. My hands were trembling, and my pulse felt like it was hammering in my neck. Then the doorknob rattled. That was enough. I grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the door. My entire body felt cold, like I was losing circulation. I swung the door open, shining the flashlight outside. Nothing. The porch was empty, but I could still hear footsteps. They were moving away from me onto the gravel road. I stepped out, shining the light around. The road was empty. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned around to go back inside, and I heard my name again. It came from a few feet away, but I couldn't see anyone. It wasn't even my full name. It was a name only a few old friends used to call me. I froze. My chest felt tight. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and leaned against it, breathing hard. For the next hour, I sat in the living room with my back against the wall. I heard random knocks on the exterior of the house. I got up a few times to check each window, but every time I looked, there was no one there. My thoughts were chaotic. I was thinking, what is this place? Why is it so empty but so full of sounds? I couldn't rest. When morning came, I decided to walk through the neighborhood, hoping I'd see someone outside. The houses all looked like they were maintained, fresh paint, clean windows, but they felt vacant. Yet I heard TV sounds behind a door, a kettle whistle from another house, and I smelled fresh coffee somewhere. But no one was visible. I tried knocking on a few doors. No one answered. I heard quick footsteps inside, but no one opened up. My nerves were on edge. I felt sweaty and my mouth was dry. After walking around for about an hour, I turned a corner and spotted a narrow alley between two brick buildings. It led to a row of houses in the back. I followed it, stepping over broken branches and some scattered trash. The alley ended at a chain-link fence, but through the fence, I saw a small backyard. There was a folding chair on the grass, and it was rocking back and forth slightly, like someone had just gotten up and left. I stepped closer, holding onto the fence. I heard a whisper. It sounded like it was inches from my ear. It said, "Go back." I jerked away, stumbling onto the ground. I scrambled to my feet and ran out of there, my heart pounding. By then I was seriously considering leaving, but I'd spent what little savings I had to move here, and I didn't have any other place lined up. I went back to my house to calm down. I boiled some water and made tea, trying to focus on something normal. While I stood at the counter, I heard the floor creak behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone. Nothing. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the mug. The air felt heavier, like the walls were closing in. I spent that evening sitting on the porch again. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the gravel road. The houses across from me were dark, the lights inside were off, and the windows were shut. Yet I still sensed activity, like the sound of someone coughing or a chair scraping the floor in one of the living rooms. Then out of nowhere, the window of the house directly across from me slid open, and I saw a faint shape. It was just a silhouette, but it made me feel exposed. I stood up, almost dropping my flashlight. The window closed again with a slam. My breath caught in my throat. I felt my heart thudding. I had the urge to shout, "Who are you?" But I knew I wouldn't get an answer. That night, I made up my mind to stay up until dawn. I didn't want to risk hearing those footsteps around my porch again. Around midnight, the usual sounds started: floorboards creaking, doors opening, objects dropping. I sat in the living room, forcing myself to stay calm. My legs were restless, and my head was throbbing from lack of sleep. Then I heard something new, a soft tapping on one of the windows. It was a rhythmic tap, tap, tap. I stood and moved quietly toward the sound, my socks barely making noise on the floor. I peeked through a gap in the curtains. I saw a vague outline, like someone standing right outside the glass. The tapping stopped. My heart was about to explode. I stepped back. In that split second, the window slammed shut on its own, the latch clicking into place. I hadn't touched it. I stumbled backward, lost my balance, and fell onto the couch. I stayed there for a few minutes, trying to catch my breath. Morning eventually came. The sky was lighter, but the feeling of dread remained. I walked outside, noticing my trash bin was on its side. The lid rolled a few feet away. It looked like something or someone had gone through it. There were footprints in the dirt, leading back toward the street. They disappeared into nothing. No sign of who made them. My stomach felt knotted. I checked my phone for messages or missed calls, but I had no signal. I hadn't realized that the cell reception was so spotty. Or maybe it was something else interfering. I made a decision right there. I was going to leave. I didn't care about losing my deposit or looking for a new place with no plan. I went inside, gathered my clothes, shoved them into a duffel bag. My hands were shaking so hard I could hardly zip it up. As I was about to toss the bag into my car, I heard a whisper behind me. It spoke a name I haven't used since I was a teenager. I spun around. No one was there. But the whisper came again. "Stay." My pulse hammered against my ribs. I chucked the bag onto the back seat, slammed the door, and looked around one last time. I saw curtains shifting in 3 different houses at once, as if something in each window was peeking out. Every window snapped shut. My knees went weak. I felt a drop of sweat trickle down my forehead. I got in my car, turned the key, and stared at the empty road. As I drove off, I heard faint footsteps on the gravel, like they were following me, even though I couldn't see anyone. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but I only saw the silent street, houses with closed windows, and the looming mountains beyond. I wish I could say I came back later or found out more about that town. I didn't. I couldn't. Something about it made me feel like I was being swallowed by silence and shadows. I still have nightmares about the footsteps and the voices calling me by names I never shared. Sometimes I can still feel that damp chill on my skin. I don't have explanations. All I know is that it wasn't empty. Whatever lived there didn't want to be seen. It only wanted me to listen, to stay, and to slip into that silence with it. I didn't stay, and I never will. I dropped to the floor on a Tuesday afternoon. My coworkers shouted my name, but everything sounded far away. My chest tightened, and my head felt like it was underwater. The lights flickered, and I thought I was just dizzy from skipping breakfast. Then everything went black. A second later, or maybe longer, my eyes snapped open. I was flat on my back, staring at fluorescent bulbs. My coworker placed a cold towel on my forehead. I heard someone say they were calling an ambulance, but I forced myself to sit up. My vision was shaky, my arms were weak, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I tried to shrug it off. I said I was fine, that I only needed water. My boss insisted I go home. I was embarrassed. I muttered an apology, grabbed my jacket, and left. On the elevator ride down, I noticed my reflection in the metal doors. My face looked pale, and there was a strange shape over my shoulder. It was a dark, blurry outline, like someone standing too close. I twisted around, but nobody was there. I faced the door again, and the shape was gone. I told myself it was my eyes playing tricks. I was still unsteady, so I let it go. Outside, the air felt warm. My legs felt heavy, and I walked slowly toward the bus stop. Halfway there, I felt a sudden jolt in my head. It was like a brief flash. Everything went white for a split second. My feet stopped, my breath caught in my throat, and I felt something brush against my right arm. When my vision cleared, I was standing in the same spot, but the bus was there already, and people were getting on. It all felt off, like I had skipped a few seconds. My watch showed the same minute as before, so I got confused. It was as if time had jumped ahead, but it hadn't really advanced on the clock. I reached the bus, climbed inside, and sat in the back. I stared at my reflection in the window. My pupils looked dilated, and I saw a flicker of movement in the window's reflection. It seemed like a shadow near my shoulder. I tried to ignore it. I shut my eyes until the ride ended. When I got to my apartment, I drank a glass of water and lay down. My hands were shaking. I felt sweaty. I tried to focus on the hum of the ceiling fan. After a few minutes, I sat up and made a sandwich. My phone kept buzzing with texts from coworkers asking if I was okay. I typed a quick reply that I felt better. Then I just stared at the screen. I couldn't push away the memory of those strange moments. I thought it was exhaustion, maybe some stress. I tried to act normal. I turned on the TV and tried to watch a random show. Around 9 p.m., my head buzzed again. It wasn't painful. It was more like a small shock that made my eyes blur for an instant. Then I felt the couch shift under me. The lights in the room flickered, or at least that's how it appeared. I could hear static from the TV. Suddenly I was sitting there, but the TV channel was different, and the clock on the wall read 9:04. I blinked fast. I checked my phone. It said 9:04. I had lost about 2 minutes, but it felt like a blink. My mouth went dry. My hands started sweating, and I rubbed them on my pants. I stood up to get a grip on what was happening. I paced around the living room and touched the wall to steady myself. I noticed a slight movement out of the corner of my eye. I thought it was the reflection of the TV on the window, but when I turned, I saw a figure near the hallway. It was pitch black, shaped like a tall person with no features. The moment I looked directly at it, it was gone. I felt my stomach tighten. A chill ran through my arms. I went to the bathroom and splashed water on my face. My reflection in the mirror looked tense with beads of water on my forehead. In the corner of the mirror, I caught a glimpse of that dark shape again, behind me. I spun around. Nothing was there. My chest felt tight. I steadied myself against the sink. I muttered to myself that I was just tired. Then I made sure my apartment was locked and turned off the lights in every room. I left the bathroom light on, though. I needed a bit of comfort. I crawled into bed, closed my eyes, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache. I called in sick to work and decided I needed to see a doctor. I felt shaky. My throat was dry. I kept hearing small creaks in the walls, which I usually ignored, but now they made me jumpy. Around 11 a.m., I managed to get ready and leave for the clinic a few blocks away. On the walk there, I kept my head down, focusing on the pavement. But I felt like someone was walking beside me. I caught glimpses of something dark in the shop windows. It moved in the corner of my eye, then vanished when I tried to look at it. My heartbeat sped up, and I clenched my fists. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and loud. At the clinic, the doctor ran some tests. Blood pressure, heart rate, blood tests, a quick check of my neurological responses. He found nothing unusual. He suggested I might be having stress-related episodes or panic attacks. He told me to rest and come back if it happened again. I nodded, but I felt frustrated. I knew this wasn't just stress. The time jumps were real, at least to me. The dark shape wasn't a random hallucination, it felt like it was there. I went home. I felt drained. I sat at my kitchen table, stared at the clock, and tried to see if anything strange happened. After an hour, I realized my life wasn't moving forward in a normal way. My phone would buzz and I'd feel a spark in my brain. Then my eyes would blur, and I'd see the same scene but advanced by a few seconds. During these flashes, I sometimes saw that dark figure near me, whispering something I couldn't understand. It was like hearing a low hiss or someone breathing words in my ear. Then I'd snap back, and everything was normal again, except for the knot in my stomach. I decided to test it. I set my phone to record video. I placed it on the table facing me. I stared at the camera, waiting for a jump. My heart rate was steady, but my forehead was covered in sweat. My palms were slick, and my legs felt tense. After about 5 minutes, I felt a slight hum in my ears, and the room seemed to tilt for a second. I blinked. Then on my phone's screen, the timer jumped forward by 4 seconds. My body jerked as if I had been startled, but I hadn't moved. I stopped the recording and played it back. The video showed me sitting there, eyes open. Then there was a glitch in the recording. It froze for a moment, and then resumed. I never moved, but it looked like a small skip in time. My stomach churned when I saw that shape in the background for a split second, standing by the kitchen door. I paused the video and stared at the screen. It was a tall, dark outline, impossible to make out any details. In the next frame, it was gone. I felt a wave of cold spread from my neck down my spine. My breath came in short bursts. I stood up and checked the kitchen door. Nothing was there. The air felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. I muttered a curse. I didn't know what to do. I replayed the video, and it happened every time. During that skip, the figure appeared for a fraction of a second. I shut off the phone and pressed my hand against my chest to calm my heartbeat. Over the next few days, the jumps continued. I tried to go about my life. I went to the supermarket, I cooked my meals, I kept my apartment clean. I tried returning to work, but the episodes happened more often under fluorescent lights and around people. Every time it happened, my vision blurred, the world seemed to stutter, and I found myself a few seconds ahead. Each time, the figure was there, sometimes whispering, sometimes just pointing at something. Once, it pointed at a door I was about to open at the office. I stopped, felt a wave of dizziness, and saw a heavy box falling off a shelf in that room. Then I blinked, and I was still standing in the corridor with no sign of the falling box. I opened the door carefully. The box sat on the shelf, not moving at all. I left it alone. I started to doubt my sanity. I felt tired all the time. My eyes stung from lack of sleep, and my limbs felt sore. I'd wake up at night hearing faint whispers like static from an old radio. Sometimes I turned on the lights and saw the shadow in the mirror by my closet. I saw it in windows, reflections on shiny surfaces, even on the blank TV screen. It was always near me, either to my left or right. Whenever I tried to approach, it disappeared. My heart would pound, and my mouth would go dry. One night, I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth. I had the tap running. My reflection in the mirror looked exhausted, dark circles under my eyes, hair messy. The tap water splashed against the sink, and the mirror fogged a bit. Then I heard a murmur. It sounded like someone telling me to stay away from something. The voice was low and raspy, barely audible over the water. I felt goosebumps on my arms. I asked, "Stay away from what?" But there was no answer. I turned off the tap, and in the silence, I heard a soft hiss. I looked at the mirror, and the figure stood behind me again. My stomach clenched. The figure's arm rose, and it pointed at me in the mirror. I whipped around, and it was gone. I leaned against the sink and forced myself to breathe normally. My head felt light. I realized that this figure might be warning me sometimes, but it also felt sinister, like it was messing with me. I couldn't tell if I was being protected from small dangers or tricked into paranoia. My body was tense all the time. My head hurt. I had trouble focusing on conversations with my boss and coworkers. One afternoon, I had a big meeting at work. I was about to step into the conference room when I felt that familiar buzz in my head. My vision went hazy. I saw the figure standing in the corner of the room. It whispered something about not entering. The overhead lights flickered. I felt a wave of nausea. Then I snapped back, and I was still outside the conference room. Everyone was inside, waiting. I pushed the door open, ignoring the whisper. The meeting started like any other. But halfway through, a bright flash came from the overhead projector. It sparked, and smoke rose from it. Everyone gasped and ran out of the room. The projector had overheated or malfunctioned. Someone unplugged it. We waited for the smell of burnt plastic to fade. Nobody got hurt, but the reaction left me shaken. That figure had told me not to go in. I had ignored it. I kept wondering if something worse could have happened. That evening, I decided I needed answers. I searched online for anything resembling time slips or shadow figures. Most of what I found seemed like theories or supernatural stories. I didn't see anything that matched exactly what I was experiencing. I found a few posts about people seeing shadow creatures during seizures or migraines, but nothing that explained these brief time jumps. My chest felt tight with frustration. I shut my laptop. I felt a flicker in my peripheral vision. The figure stood near the bedroom door, just staring. I said out loud, "What do you want?" My voice cracked. It made no sound. It just stared. I felt my gut twist in fear. Then it lifted an arm and pointed to my phone on the table. My phone rang. I jerked around to look at the screen. It showed my friend's name. I glanced back and the figure was gone. My friend asked if I wanted to grab dinner. I said yes, just to get out of the apartment. We met at a diner. The lights were dim and the place smelled like frying oil. My friend kept asking if I was okay. I said I was just tired. We chatted about work, about mundane stuff. My eyes flicked around the diner, scanning for shadows. I didn't see any. I actually relaxed for a while, but when I looked at the window next to our booth, I saw a faint silhouette across the street, near a street lamp. My pulse quickened and I felt a cold sweat on my back. It was that same outline, standing there looking in my direction. I swallowed hard and tried to stay calm. My friend didn't notice anything. We finished eating, and I made an excuse to leave. Back in my apartment, I locked the door and turned on every light. The place felt too quiet. Around 10 p.m., I experienced the biggest jump yet. My body froze. My eyes went dim. I felt my legs buckle. For a moment, I was in the hallway of my apartment building. The lights overhead buzzed, and the figure was next to me. It whispered, "Go back." Then I saw something in the corner. A small electrical panel was sparking. Smoke came from it. I heard an alarm. Then I felt a painful snap in my brain, and I was back in my living room. It was 10 Gauss on the dot. I bolted upright, grabbed my keys, and ran to the hallway. The electrical panel there wasn't smoking, but I smelled something burning. I sprinted to the manager's door and told him I smelled smoke. He checked the panel and discovered some wiring was overheating. He shut down the power before it could start a fire. We stood in the hallway with flashlights, waiting for an electrician. He asked me how I knew it was about to fail. I said I just smelled it. He shook his head, but he didn't push the topic. Now I'm back in my apartment writing this down. The power is restored. I feel a tightness in my chest. My hands won't stop trembling. I keep looking over my shoulder. Sometimes the shadow is there. Sometimes it isn't. I don't know if it's guiding me or trying to break me down. All I know is that these jumps are real to me. My heartbeat is racing every time the air hums or the lights flicker. My senses are on high alert. I'm afraid to sleep. I'm afraid of what I'll see when I open my eyes. But I can't run from it. Wherever I go, it follows. And every time I skip a few seconds into the future, it's waiting for me, whispering or pointing. I can't decide if I should listen or fight it. Right now, I'm just sitting here, breathing fast, trying to keep still. I don't want to close my eyes. I don't want to see that shape again. But I know it's there, somewhere behind me. And I know it's not done with me yet. I felt my stomach tighten the moment I stepped into that old house. The first thing I noticed was the big stuffed crow on the mantel above the fireplace. It was larger than I expected, with dusty wings and black glass eyes that seemed too reflective. The place had a stale odor, like it hadn't been aired out in years. The house belonged to a cousin who moved overseas. He said I could stay here while I sorted out some work issues. He didn't mention the crow. I stared at it for a few seconds, then set my bags on the floor. I heard a slight creak behind me, but when I turned, nothing moved. It was quiet. I shrugged it off and started bringing in my other boxes. I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking. The house had a small living room that opened into a modest kitchen. There were 2 bedrooms down a short hallway. The floorboards were warped, and every step made a dull thump or squeak. When the sun started to set, I realized how isolated this place felt. The nearest neighbor was across a field. I could see a few lights out there, but mostly it was just darkness. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. My back ached from hauling boxes, and I decided to heat up some soup. While the soup warmed on the stove, I found myself looking at the crow again. It was perched on a wooden stand, wings folded tight, head tilted slightly upward. The feathers looked real, though worn around the edges. I stepped closer and examined the beak. It was large and sharp. I could see dust in the small gaps between each feather. The eyes seemed to follow me even when I stood off to the side. I felt a pressure in my chest, like I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just nerves. I grabbed the spoon, stirred the soup, and tried to ignore the feeling that the crow was watching me. Later that night, after finishing my dinner, I decided to go to bed early. I had a long day ahead of me, cleaning up the house and getting used to my new routine. I closed the bedroom door, but I could still see the living room if I looked through the small gap near the hinges. The crow was just beyond that opening, motionless. I lay in bed, hearing the wind outside. Branches scraped against the house. I tried to tune it out, but I kept hearing soft creaks from the living room. I told myself it was the house settling. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke up to a thump in the middle of the night. My heart hammered as I sat up. I listened. Another thump, like something tapping the wall from outside. I swung my legs out of bed and crept to the window. I pulled the curtain aside. In the moonlight, I spotted 3 or 4 dark shapes perched on the windowsill. They were crows, live ones. Their heads were turned toward me. They weren't cawing or making any sound. They just sat there staring in my direction. I felt my throat tighten. The glass separated us by only a few inches, and I could see their eyes glinting. Then I heard a faint tap. One of them pecked the window once, then went still again. I backed away, bumped into the corner of the bed, and let the curtain fall. I stood there for a minute, breathing hard. I told myself that crows sometimes gather at night, but I'd never seen them quietly perched like that, watching. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I reached for the bedroom door, opened it just a crack, and looked into the living room. Moonlight filtered through the window there, illuminating the fireplace. The stuffed crow was still on its perch. I exhaled, relieved that nothing in the house had changed. Then I heard the tapping again, this time from the living room windows. I slipped into the hallway and peered around the corner. More crows sat on the windowsill by the couch. They were silent, except for an occasional click of their beaks against the glass. I glanced at the stuffed crow. In the dim light, it appeared to tilt its head, but I couldn't be sure. My eyes were probably playing tricks on me. I hurried back to bed and locked the door. I barely slept that night. The tapping continued on and off until dawn. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains. I braced myself, half expecting to see crows on the sill, but they were gone. I walked into the living room, rubbing my eyes. I stopped in my tracks when I saw something on the floor. A single black feather. It looked fresh, not dusty or old. It wasn't from the stuffed crow. I felt my pulse quicken. The windows were shut and locked from the inside, but somehow that feather got in. I tossed the feather in the trash and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I had chores to do. I dusted surfaces, swept the floors, and straightened up the old furniture. The entire time I kept noticing the stuffed crow out of the corner of my eye. It seemed different now, like its head was angled just a bit more toward the doorway. At one point I swore the left wing looked a bit more open than before. I tried to ignore these thoughts. I told myself I was letting the late-night visit get to me. By midday I decided to move the crow off the mantel. I wanted it out of sight. I figured I could store it somewhere until I left. I dragged a chair over to the fireplace, climbed up, and reached for the crow. As soon as I touched it, the lights flickered. The television turned on by itself, blasting static. I jerked around, lost my balance, and almost fell. My hand was still on the stuffed crow's back. The TV kept hissing. I climbed down, set the crow carefully on the coffee table, and grabbed the remote. I clicked it off, but the static stayed on the screen. It wouldn't shut off. The power button did nothing. My pulse pounded in my ears. The overhead light flickered more intensely, then went out completely, leaving the living room lit only by daylight from the windows. I reached for the lamp on the side table. It clicked, but no light came. I unplugged the TV from the wall. The screen finally went black. I stood there for a few moments, breathing hard, wondering if this was just an electrical glitch. I looked at the crow on the table. Its beak was parted slightly as if about to make a sound. My hands were trembling. I placed the crow on the floor next to the couch and hurried to the fuse box in the kitchen. Nothing seemed tripped. I flipped each switch off and on, then walked back to the living room. The overhead light came back, dim but steady. Relief washed over me. I grabbed the crow again, intending to take it to the attic. Right when my fingers touched its wings, I heard a crash in the kitchen. I ran in and saw that a few pans had fallen off the counter. It looked like they'd been yanked off, but I didn't see anyone else around. I started feeling dizzy. My forehead was damp with sweat. I looked back into the living room and saw the crow upright, balanced on the coffee table. I was sure I'd left it on the floor. I swallowed hard, feeling my heartbeat hammer in my chest. I wanted to get rid of that thing, but every time I tried to move it, something weird happened. I told myself to calm down and do it anyway. I walked over, trying to keep my legs steady. I picked up the crow. Nothing happened at first. I took a few steps toward the hallway. The phone rang, making me jump. I dropped the crow on the couch. It landed on its side, wings slightly spread. I ran to the phone and lifted the receiver. The line crackled. I said hello, but there was only that static noise. Then, underneath the static, I heard my name whispered. My stomach twisted and I felt goosebumps on my arms. I slammed the phone down. I stepped back, ran a hand over my face, and tried to steady my breathing. The rest of the afternoon was tense. I stayed out of the living room as much as possible. I spent time in the bedroom scrolling on my phone, but I noticed the signal kept dropping. Around dusk, I forced myself to make dinner. I walked into the kitchen, eyes flicking nervously toward the couch. The crow was still there, half on its side. I left the overhead light on, not wanting to be in the dark. As I chopped vegetables, I heard a faint flapping sound near the windows. I froze, knife in hand. I peered out the window and saw at least half a dozen crows perched on the fence outside. They were staring at the house. They didn't move much. They looked like statues. I tried to eat, but my stomach felt too tight. The idea of spending another night here, with that thing in the house and the live crows outside, made me sweat. I decided to try once more to put the stuffed crow away. I grabbed a cardboard box and went into the living room. I found the crow upright on the couch facing the window. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I felt a wave of nausea, but I stepped forward, lifted it carefully, and set it in the box. This time, the light stayed on, and nothing crashed. I carried the box to the hall closet. I put it on a high shelf and shut the door. I breathed a long sigh of relief and tried to calm my nerves. I started to walk back to the living room when I heard a loud thud from the closet. I stopped in my tracks. My heart raced. I forced myself to open the closet door. The box was on the floor, upside down. The crow was lying next to it, eyes turned toward me. I felt shaky. My mouth was dry. I lifted the crow again, put it in the box, and slid the box behind some old blankets. I closed the door and held it shut for a moment, half expecting it to burst open. Nothing happened. I wanted to leave, but I needed this place for a few days. I told myself I'd manage somehow. I kept telling myself there must be a logical explanation, though deep down, I didn't believe it. I turned on every light in the house. Then I heard a faint tapping on the windows. I walked over to the nearest window and looked outside. At least 15 crows were perched on the porch railing and the windowsills. They were all looking straight at me. Their eyes had an eerie shine in the glow of the porch light. I heard soft tapping as their beaks touched the glass one at a time in a slow rhythm. I backed away, arms trembling. I decided to keep the curtains closed. I grabbed an old blanket and pinned it over the window, trying to block the sight of them. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped a thumbtack on the floor. I knelt to pick it up and jumped when I heard a loud rap on the glass. It was so forceful I thought the window might break. My heart pounded, and I scrambled back. It was nearly midnight when I finally decided to try sleeping again. I couldn't stand being in the living room, so I locked myself in the bedroom. I pulled the curtain shut. I turned off the lamp, but every few seconds I'd see faint shadows flickering outside. It was the crows circling around the house. Their wings made rustling sounds. Occasionally, one would land on the windowsill with a thud. I stared at the ceiling, trying not to panic. My body felt tense and my skin was clammy with sweat. At around 3 in the morning, I heard something in the hallway. It sounded like footsteps, but too light to be a person. I swallowed hard, grabbed the lamp from the nightstand, and forced myself to open the door. The hallway was dark, except for the faint glow from a nightlight near the bathroom. As I moved forward, the floorboards creaked under my bare feet. I heard a scraping sound from the living room. I crept closer, heart hammering. I reached the living room doorway and flicked the switch. Nothing happened. The overhead light stayed off. I tried again, but it was dead. The only light came from the moon through a gap in the curtains. I saw a shape near the fireplace. It looked like a large, hunched figure with wings. I couldn't see it clearly, but it was bigger than the stuffed crow. My chest tightened, and a rush of cold fear swept over me. I gripped the lamp in my hand, about to raise it like a weapon. Then I blinked, and the shape was gone. In its place, I saw the closet door half open. The box was on the floor, lids flung aside. The crow was perched on top of the couch. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. I backed away, stumbling over the coffee table. I knocked over an empty glass, which rolled across the floor. The crow's head twitched toward the noise. I couldn't see its eyes clearly in the dim light, but I felt them on me. A sudden gust rattled the windows. I heard a muffled voice in the wind, like someone whispering my name. My legs went weak. I wanted to run outside, but the thought of those crows surrounding me stopped me. I could hear them fluttering and pecking at the windows. The door might be blocked by them. I was trapped. I ran back to the bedroom and slammed the door. My breathing was ragged. My skin felt hot and my face was damp with sweat. I jammed a chair under the doorknob. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The tapping on the windows continued. Sometimes it was slow. Sometimes it sped up, like they were trying to make some kind of signal. My mind raced with possibilities, but I tried not to think. I just wanted the night to end. Somewhere around dawn, the tapping eased off. I heard the crows flapping away. I waited until full daylight before I opened the door again. I crept into the living room. The closet was still open, the box on the floor. The stuffed crow was on the mantel, back where it had originally been. It stood upright, wings folded. The entire house felt cold, despite the morning sun shining through the windows. I walked to the window and peeked out. The yard was empty, no crows in sight. My pulse still throbbed in my temples, and I realized I was hungry and exhausted. I made some coffee and tried to think straight. I knew I had to leave, but I had nowhere else to go that day. I decided to pack my car and drive into town, maybe find a motel for the night. I started gathering my things, eyes flicking over to the crow every few seconds. The more I looked, the more it seemed to tilt its head. I could almost imagine it turning to watch me. My face flushed with anxiety. I fumbled with my bag, stuffed random clothes into it and zipped it halfway. Then I heard a soft scraping near the fireplace. I spun around, but the crow was still perched in the same position. I grabbed my car keys off the kitchen table and headed for the front door. The moment I reached for the doorknob, a flurry of wings exploded outside. I saw black shapes moving past the windows, blocking the sunlight. The cawing started up, echoing through the yard. My arm shook. I took a deep breath, opened the door a crack and peeked out. Crows filled the porch railing and the nearby trees, all staring silently again. The wind picked up and I heard my name in it once more. I slammed the door shut, heart racing. I stepped back. I looked at the mantel and the crow was still there, like it was waiting for me to make a move. I felt stuck, too scared to push past the crows and leave, too terrified to stay inside with that stuffed thing. My hands tingled with adrenaline. The house groaned, and the branches outside scraped against the siding. I wanted to scream, but I held it in. Instead, I took a few steps toward the fireplace, toward the stuffed crow. My throat was tight. I could see a faint layer of dust on its wings. I could hear the crows outside shifting on the porch, rustling their feathers. I decided I had to act. I lifted the crow from its perch, ignoring the chill that ran down my arms. I held it out in front of me. My teeth were clenched. The wind outside rattled the windows and I heard the cawing get louder. I took one step toward the door, crow in hand, mind racing, prepared to force my way out. That's when every light in the house clicked off again. The living room plunged into shadow. The cawing outside reached a fever pitch, like they were all screaming at once. I felt something shift under my grip, and I swore the stuffed crow's wings moved. My grip loosened. I stumbled back, banging my shoulder against the wall. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. When I finally managed to take another step, the cawing stopped. Silence filled the house, thick and suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I could sense the presence of the flock outside, and I could feel the weight of the crow in my hands. I remember thinking I had to leave, no matter what. But at that exact moment, the front door handle rattled from the outside like something was testing it. I froze, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the door. That was the moment I realized I wasn't sure if I could get out. And I still don't know what's waiting out there, or what's inside here with me. I drove out to that lake right after I finished my last day of work for the month. I felt exhausted and wanted a place where I could sit alone and ignore my email and phone calls. I chose this spot because a friend told me it was secluded and quiet. I believed it would give me some peace. I drove for about 5 hours, most of it on an old highway, and then turned onto a dirt road that led me deeper into the woods. The trip was bumpy and full of potholes. My back hurt from the uneven ride and my arms felt tense from gripping the steering wheel too hard. When I arrived, it was almost sunset, and I saw a calm body of water through the trees. It looked clean, and it spread out behind some thick pines. I felt relieved. I thought I'd found the perfect spot to clear my head and relax. I got out of my car, stretched my legs, and unpacked my tent and a small folding chair. The air felt crisp and I noticed a slight chill, so I kept a light jacket on. My boots sank a little into the soft dirt near the shore. The lake was smooth, with only a few ripples from a gentle breeze. It was quiet. I heard some birds in the distance and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. I set up my tent in a clearing about 20 yards from the water. I thought that was close enough to enjoy the view without worrying about water creeping in if it rained. After I got my tent up, I gathered some stones to form a small fire ring. I brought a lighter and some dry kindling I kept in the trunk of my car. It took me a few attempts to start the fire because the breeze kept blowing out my flame, but eventually I got it going. I opened a can of beans and heated it up in a small metal pot. I ate while sitting in my folding chair, looking at the lake. At that moment, everything seemed normal. My shoulders relaxed, and I took a few deep breaths. I felt good to be away from my usual problems. Night fell sooner than I expected. The sky turned dark, and the stars appeared in clusters I wasn't used to seeing. I saw no nearby campfires or cabin lights. The only light came from the moon and my small fire. I caught a faint reflection of myself in the water whenever I stood up to check on my gear. I noticed how dark the lake surface looked under the moonlight. It seemed almost like black glass. I decided to keep the fire going for warmth and a bit of light. The temperature dropped and my nose felt cold, but I felt comfortable enough. I turned in around 10 o'clock. I zipped up the tent and crawled into my sleeping bag. I could still hear soft water sounds and a slight rustling of leaves. I drifted off but woke up sometime in the middle of the night. My eyes felt sticky, but I sensed something off. I noticed a faint glow through my tent walls, so I unzipped the flap and looked out. The fire had died down to embers, but the lake's surface had a pale reflection of moonlight. At first, I thought I saw the outlines of large rocks or submerged trees near the center of the lake. Then I realized they weren't there before. I narrowed my eyes and leaned forward. The water reflected outlines that seemed like tall, broken structures rising out of the depths, but they didn't actually break the surface. I couldn't see anything on the real water. The reflection in the moonlight, though, showed something that looked like ruins of old buildings. I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to dismiss it as a trick of the light, but my heart pounded. I told myself I was just groggy. I tried to calm down by splashing a little water on my face from a bottle in the tent. Then I crawled back into my sleeping bag. I still felt uneasy, but I eventually fell asleep again. In the morning, the sun lit up the lake in a normal way. The water looked clear. I stood on the shoreline, scanning the surface for any sign of those shapes. Nothing. It looked like any other lake. No towers, no structures. I ate a protein bar for breakfast, then boiled some water for coffee. While I sat on a small log, I kept looking at the lake, trying to see if I'd just imagined something. I felt a mild headache. I told myself the night can play tricks on people. Maybe I half-dreamed it. I spent the rest of the day reading a paperback book I brought along, walking around the perimeter of the lake and collecting more firewood. My plan was to stay there for 3 nights, and I still had 2 more to go. Everything felt pretty normal in the daylight. The only slightly odd thing happened when I put my foot in the water to feel the temperature. I felt a brief sensation of pins and needles in my toes, almost like an electric current. It went away as soon as I pulled my foot out. I assumed the cold triggered that feeling. When night fell again, I lit a stronger fire. I made sure I had a good supply of wood to keep it going. The sky was clear, and the moon was even brighter than before. I sat near the fire, ate some instant noodles, and tried to distract myself with a few songs I had saved on my phone. But the phone's battery was dying, so I turned it off. That's when the quiet became more noticeable. I couldn't hear any birds or insects. The only sound came from the crackling fire and my own breathing. I felt a strong urge to look at the water. I don't know why, but it felt like a pull in my chest. I got up and walked over to the shore, letting my boots sink slightly into the damp sand. The moonlight lit the lake enough for me to see some ripples near the center. Then I noticed those reflections again. This time it wasn't just vague shapes. I saw what looked like tall columns, arches, and partial walls under the surface. It was like I was looking at a city under the water, but the actual surface in front of me showed nothing but dark water. The reflection was the only place I saw those forms. I felt a jolt of fear and my mouth went dry. I leaned forward, looking for any logical explanation. Maybe there were old ruins at the bottom, but I thought that if there were real ruins, I would at least see some outline under the water itself. That wasn't happening. The reflection seemed to hover on the surface, shimmering and shifting. My stomach started to twist. I felt sweat on my forehead even though the air was cold. Then I heard a sound behind me, almost like a whisper or a faint voice saying something I couldn't make out. I spun around. Nothing was there. I only saw my tent and the dying fire. When I looked back at the lake, the reflections were still there. I heard that voice again, and it sounded like it was coming from inside the water. It wasn't in a language I recognized. It rose and fell in quiet waves like someone chanting. My heart pounded. I backed away from the shoreline and hurried toward my tent. I tried to calm my breathing by taking slow inhales. My skin felt prickly, and my arms felt tight from adrenaline. I decided to get into my sleeping bag and try to ignore whatever I'd witnessed. I lay awake for at least an hour, listening. My ears rang from the silence, and every now and then I thought I heard soft splashes or that strange murmuring voice. I didn't want to look outside. Eventually, I dozed off out of sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I woke up feeling stiff and groggy. My eyes felt heavy, and I noticed a dull ache in the back of my head. I walked down to the water's edge. In daylight, everything looked normal again. I drank some water from my bottle. I didn't feel much like eating. The place started to make me uneasy. I wanted to go home, but I also felt a strange pull. It was like the lake wanted me to stay and figure out what was going on. I told myself I was just spooking myself, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was under that water watching me. I passed the day by fishing lazily with a small rod and some bait I'd brought. I didn't catch anything. I felt distracted, always looking at the water's surface. Around midday, I swear I saw something move under the water. Something large. I saw a slow, sweeping shadow pass about 30 feet from shore. It vanished in an instant, and the lake went still again. I felt my pulse jump. My hands got clammy on the fishing rod. I reeled in the line and decided to just sit back. My head pounded again. By late afternoon, the sky started turning a little gray. I thought it might rain, so I gathered more wood and made sure my tent was secure. I considered leaving right then, but I also felt like I needed an answer about those reflections and the whispering voices. I stayed, even though my gut told me it wasn't wise. I felt drawn, almost like I couldn't leave until I saw more. When night came, the wind picked up a bit. I could hear branches swaying. My fire struggled, but I fed it enough wood to keep it alive. I walked to the shoreline again, my flashlight in one hand. The water looked pitch black. The moon and stars were hidden behind clouds, but every so often the moonlight broke through. That's when I saw them again, the outlines of ruins. This time they looked even clearer, like I was staring at a city of broken pillars and half-collapsed walls under the surface. My stomach churned. I shined my flashlight on the water, but the beam showed nothing except a few ripples. I stood there, trembling, and I heard soft splashing from the far side of the lake. I turned my head, trying to see what caused it. The splashing stopped, and a moment later I glimpsed long, thin shapes moving near the opposite shore. They stood upright, but they didn't look like normal people. Their limbs were too long, and they moved in a slow, deliberate way, like they were searching for something along the edge. I held my breath. My eyes started to water because I forgot to blink. I felt panic rise and my knees shook. My brain told me to run to the car, but I couldn't look away. Each time the moon peeked through the clouds, I saw them more clearly. Tall, slender figures pale in the faint light with arms that dangled close to their knees. I couldn't see their faces from that distance. I froze, and I sensed my heart hammering in my chest. My throat felt tight. Then, as if they sensed me, they turned their heads in my direction. I heard a wet sloshing sound, and the shapes sank back into the darkness. I practically stumbled backward, almost losing my balance on the sandy ground. When I regained my footing, I turned and sprinted to my fire, breathing hard. My tongue felt dry and my chest burned. I wanted to leave, but my car was parked right behind my tent in a small clearing that was barely wide enough to turn around in the dark. The road out was rough, and I wasn't sure if I'd get stuck trying to drive in panic. I also felt that weird tug again, like something in the lake was calling me to come closer. It felt like a physical pull in my chest. I forced myself to sit by the fire for a while, gathering my thoughts. My mind raced. I wiped sweat from my forehead even though the air felt cold. At some point, I got up and shined my flashlight on the water again. The shapes weren't visible, and I didn't hear the splashing, but the reflection of the water caught my eye. I saw myself, but my face in the reflection looked distorted. My eyes appeared off, the mouth seemed twisted in a forced grin, and my head tilted in a way I wasn't tilting it in real life. I jerked back, dropping the flashlight. I felt a surge of nausea in my stomach. I bent down, picked up the flashlight with a shaky hand, and looked again. This time the reflection seemed normal. I didn't feel sure of anything. I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks. My arms were trembling and I could barely keep the flashlight steady. I just wanted to go inside my tent and hide, but I didn't trust that thin layer of nylon to protect me from anything. I heard a whisper again. It came from the lake. It sounded soft but insistent, like it was saying my name. The voice didn't match anyone I knew. It sent a chill down my spine. I forced myself to move away from the shore. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and grabbed my sleeping bag, curling up inside it. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I closed my eyes and tried to shut out every noise. I had no idea what time it was when I finally fell asleep. The next morning I woke up feeling like I had barely rested. My body felt sore, and my head throbbed. I unzipped the tent and looked at the lake. Everything looked calm again. Birds perched on some branches near the shoreline. The water shone with a normal grayish-blue color. No ruins, no creatures, no voices. I breathed heavily, trying to decide what to do. My mind felt hazy, but I realized I needed to leave. My plan was to stay 3 nights, and I'd done that, but I didn't even care about sticking to that plan anymore. I just wanted to get far away. I started packing up my gear. I threw my sleeping bag into the trunk and folded the tent in a messy bundle. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but the morning stayed bright and clear. By the time I got everything loaded, my pulse had settled a bit. The back of my neck still felt tense. Before I drove off, I walked down to the shore one last time just to confirm it all looked normal. The water was calm. I heard a couple of crows calling. The reflection of the surrounding trees matched reality, and I didn't see anything else. Then a small ripple appeared in the center of the lake, like something big was moving just beneath the surface. It vanished a second later. My stomach flipped. I turned and hurried back to my car. I got in, started the engine, and navigated the dirt road out of the woods. My tires hit the potholes hard and my car bounced around. My hands were sweaty on the steering wheel. When I finally reached the old highway, I exhaled and sped toward home, leaving that lake behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't care if I might have hallucinated half of it. I just knew I never wanted to see that place again. That was the last time I camped anywhere near a body of water. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can picture those shifting ruins in the moonlight. I can hear those distant whispers. Sometimes, I catch my own reflection in a window or a mirror, and I feel a flash of dread, like I'll see that twisted face again. I haven't, but I still feel that cold grip of fear. I try not to think about what might still be waiting under the water of that remote lake. Sometimes, late at night, I dream I'm standing on that shore again, and I feel the same pull in my chest. I wake up with my heart pounding and sweat on my face. I remind myself I'm safe at home, but I can't forget that empty voice calling out, echoing across that dark water. I woke up with a dry throat and a pounding in my head. My eyes felt gritty, like I hadn't slept well. I climbed out of bed and went straight to the bathroom. I flipped on the light. The bulb buzzed before it lit up. I rubbed my eyes and leaned toward the mirror over the sink. I wasn't there. The mirror showed the sink. It showed the tiles on the wall behind me. It showed everything else, but it didn't show me. I leaned in closer, still nothing. My chest tightened. I felt a rush of cold in my gut. I blinked a few times and turned to look at the bathroom door. Everything else seemed normal. So I faced the mirror again. The reflection only showed the room. I lifted my hand, tried to see any outline or shadow. Nothing. My throat dried up even more. I grabbed the edge of the sink and took a few steady breaths. My first thought was that I was half asleep and missing something obvious. I turned the tap and splashed cold water on my face. I felt it soak my skin, drip down my chin and hit the sink. But in the mirror, there was no sign of me. A shiver ran up my arms and my shoulders tensed. I felt a pulse beating in my neck. I forced myself to move. I reached out and touched the mirror with my fingertips. It was solid and cool under my hand. I glanced at my own arm. I could see my arm right in front of my eyes, but the mirror had nothing. I tried my phone next. I dried my hands on a towel, pulled the phone from my sweatpants pocket, and opened the camera. I aimed the front-facing camera at my face. The screen showed a blank frame behind me. No figure. I tested the rear camera, flipping it around. Nothing. It picked up the wall, the sink, all the bathroom details, but not me. My hands started shaking. I shut off the camera and locked the phone. The pounding in my head got worse. I left the bathroom. I walked to the living room where I had a large window facing the street. The morning light was bright. I leaned in and looked at the window's reflection. The glass picked up the couch, the coffee table, my bookshelf. No me. It looked like I wasn't standing there. My breath came in short bursts. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. I moved from side to side, checking if any faint shape of me showed up. Still nothing. I sat on the arm of my couch and tried to stay calm. My heart was racing. I took deep breaths, but each breath felt shallow. I touched my chest and pressed gently. I was sure I was physically there. I felt my own skin and my muscles. I was still dressed in my old sweatpants and a worn t-shirt. I was sure I existed in a physical sense, but the visual evidence said otherwise. I decided to test something else. I went into the bedroom and grabbed a pen from my nightstand. I drew a small dot on my left wrist. The ink soaked into my skin. I got up and stood in front of the glass door of my closet. Again, I saw the room behind me, but no outline of my body. I looked at my wrist in real life, saw the black dot. I looked back at the glass door. Nothing. My head felt heavy, like I was moving through thick air. I swallowed hard and forced myself to think. No reflection in the mirror, no appearance in photos, no visibility in any reflective surface. For a moment, I panicked that maybe I'd died somehow. But I was breathing, touching things, feeling pain in my head, hearing my heartbeat in my ears. I shook that thought away. Then I decided to call a friend to see if they could see me. I grabbed my phone again and dialed my coworker, Paul. Paul picked up after a couple of rings. I just said, "Hey, can you come over for a second? Something weird is going on." My voice sounded shaky. He said, "Are you okay? You sound off." I replied, "I just need a favor. I'll explain when you get here." He agreed to come by in about 20 minutes. While I waited, I paced around my living room. I kept glancing at the window to see if I could catch any glimpse of my reflection. It stayed blank. My stomach turned. I had a sense that something was in the room with me, like a static in the air, but I couldn't pinpoint anything. I walked to the kitchen and gulped water from a glass. I set it down on the counter. My hands were still shaky. When Paul arrived, I opened the door. He looked me in the eyes and said, "Hey man, you look pale. Are you sure you're all right?" He clearly saw me. That was a relief. At least I was visible to other people. I let him in and I said, "I need you to look at something. Just come with me to the bathroom." He frowned but followed me. I flipped on the bathroom light again. I stepped in front of the mirror. Paul stood behind me and stared at the mirror. He said, That's weird. I see you right here, but in the mirror, nothing." My stomach lurched. Paul reached around me and waved his hand in front of the glass. The mirror reflected his arm, but not my body. His eyes went wide. He took a step back. "Okay," he said, sounding uneasy. "I can see you in real life. I just can't see you in the mirror. That's impossible." I nodded and felt sweat drip down my temple. "It's happening with photos, too." I pulled out my phone and tried to take a selfie with him standing next to me. The result showed him in the rest of the bathroom, but I was missing from the shot. He stared at my phone, then at me. He didn't say anything for a solid 10 seconds. Finally, he said, "This is messed up. Have you been feeling sick? Did anything happen last night or this morning?" I shrugged. "I woke up with a headache. I felt off. But that's it. I don't know what to do." Paul ran his hand over his face. "I'm not sure what to tell you. You might want to go to a doctor, but how do you explain something like this?" I started to feel lightheaded, so I leaned against the wall. My fingers tingled. My eyes darted between him and my missing reflection. "Could you just keep me company for a while? I'm worried something else might happen." He nodded. "Sure. Let's sit down and think this through." We went to the living room. I felt the couch cushion under me, which was at least a reminder that I was still physically present. Paul sat across from me, legs jiggling with nervous energy. He kept staring at me like he expected me to vanish. About an hour passed. We tried to call a few doctors, but we sounded crazy trying to explain my situation. Nobody took us seriously. During that time, I kept walking around my apartment, checking reflective surfaces. My reflection never showed up. Paul confirmed it every time. Eventually, he said he needed to head to work. He promised to call me later. After he left, I felt alone. The silence in my apartment pressed on my eardrums. I started to notice flickers in reflective surfaces. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Then I realized I was seeing shapes that moved on their own. I'd walk by a window, and I'd catch a glimpse of something shift at the edge of the reflection. It looked like a dark outline. It would jerk in a way that seemed off. I spent the rest of the day checking everything in my place that had some reflective property. Windows, the TV screen, the metal finish on the toaster, even the lid of a shiny pot. Each time I either saw nothing of myself or I saw a dark smudge in the distance. That smudge started to look more human as the afternoon went on. I could see a vague silhouette standing far in the background, twisting in a bizarre way. Sometimes it lifted an arm like it was copying me, but it never matched my movements perfectly. My chest felt tight. My breathing grew shallow. Every time I saw that shape, my stomach flipped. I hurried away from reflective surfaces and sat in my bedroom with the lights off. That made me feel a little better, but not much. I noticed my pulse in my wrists. My throat felt constricted. I tried to distract myself by making something to eat. I forced down a sandwich even though I wasn't hungry. As I opened the fridge door, the light inside flickered off for a moment. I stared at the silver handle, noticing my own hand gripping it. In the handle's reflection, I could see the edge of that same shape. It was further away than it should have been. My legs got weak. I slammed the fridge door and stumbled back. I felt a desperate need to get outside. Maybe a change of scenery would help. So I left the apartment and walked down the hallway of my building. I paused at the glass window by the stairs. It showed the parking lot, the cars, the trees, and nothing of me. I clenched my jaw and tried not to think about it. I forced myself down the stairs and out the front door into the fresh air. I walked around the neighborhood. Occasionally, I stopped near parked cars to see if their windows reflected me. They didn't. I kept moving. People passed by me, but nobody acted like I was missing. They saw me, I saw them. I wondered if any reflective surface around them would show that strange shape. I tried not to stare at every piece of glass, but I couldn't help it. Every time I glanced, the shape was there. Sometimes very faint, sometimes slightly clearer. It was always at a distance. It seemed to shift whenever I blinked. I felt a tingling in my scalp. My eyes burned from stress. My body tensed up. I decided to go into a coffee shop just to be around other people. I ordered a coffee, forced a smile at the barista. She didn't notice anything unusual about me. I took the coffee to a table in the corner, away from the large windows. I checked the stainless steel napkin holder on the table. My reflection wasn't there, of course, but now I saw what looked like a blurry figure behind me, leaning. My stomach twisted. I pushed the napkin holder away and focused on drinking the coffee. It tasted bitter, Or maybe it was my nerves. After I finished, I left in a hurry. My legs moved with a jittery speed. On the sidewalk, I spotted a puddle near the curb. I forced myself to look at it. The water was dark and murky, but it still showed a bit of reflection from the sky and the buildings. I saw no sign of me, only that same silhouette, hunched in the puddle's reflection. It was closer now, maybe just a few steps behind me in that watery image. My heart pounded. I couldn't handle it. I rushed back to my apartment, ignoring the curious looks from strangers as I jogged. Inside my place, I shut the door hard. My breathing was ragged. I locked the deadbolt. My shoulders trembled. I took a few seconds to calm down, but the tension in my body wouldn't go away. I thought about turning all the mirrors around or covering them. Then I realized it wouldn't help with everything else that reflected. Windows, phones, spoons, anything. I felt trapped. I saw a faint shift in the black TV screen across the room. I stepped up to it and stared at the blank screen. I could see a faint outline of my living room. The reflection was dim, but I saw movement in the background. The shape was standing at an angle, like it was leaning out from the corner of the reflection. It lifted an arm. I lifted mine. It made a slow, twisting gesture, like it was mocking me. My skin crawled. The hair on my arms stood on end. I had a sudden urge to throw the TV off the stand, but I held back. I pulled out my phone to call Paul again. He answered after a few rings. He sounded anxious. He asked if everything was okay. I told him what was happening, how I was starting to see a shape in the reflections. He stayed quiet for a moment, then said he'd come over again. I felt a wave of relief. Maybe having someone around would keep me from losing it. An hour later, Paul arrived. By then, the sun was going down. The apartment felt darker than usual. I'd kept most curtains closed to avoid reflections. Paul stepped in, took one look at me, and said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I told him, I'm not seeing ghosts. I'm seeing something else. It's everywhere, but only where I should be reflected. He asked if he could see it, so I grabbed a handheld mirror from the bathroom and angled it near the lamp. As I held it, I saw the shape in the reflection. It was closer now, maybe the size of a person. Its outline shifted, its arms seemed longer than normal. Paul looked over my shoulder. He went pale. He muttered, "What the hell?" We stood there for a minute, watching this shape twist around in the reflection. When I moved my arm, it moved an arm. When I stepped left, it stepped left, but the timing was always off. It was like a broken puppet imitation. My heart pounded in my temples. Paul set his hand on my shoulder. It wasn't comforting. I could feel he was shaking. He whispered, "Do you feel anything, like physically?" I answered, "My heart is racing. I feel sweaty. I feel like I'm about to pass out." He sighed and backed away from the mirror. "I don't know what to do. Maybe we can drive to the emergency room. At least we can talk to someone in person." I nodded. That plan made some sense. Being stuck here alone with that shape creeping up in every reflection felt unbearable. So we grabbed our jackets and walked to his car. I noticed the windows on the car. I tried not to look at them. I didn't want to see that figure's face, if it even had one. We drove off. Paul kept asking if I was okay. I just said I felt dizzy. The streetlights blurred past. I avoided looking at the side mirror. Eventually, I couldn't help it. I glanced at the passenger side mirror. The silhouette was there, pressed up against the background. It was so close that I thought I saw the shape of a head tilting. My stomach churned. I pressed my back against the car seat and shut my eyes. We got to the hospital, but the waiting area was crowded. After an hour of sitting under fluorescent lights, we realized we'd be there all night. And I didn't feel physically sick aside from my nerves. I decided it wouldn't help to stay. We headed back to the apartment. On the drive home, the shape in the mirror seemed even closer. I could swear it was sitting in the back seat, but when I turned around, I saw nothing. My mouth felt dry. My arms shook. Paul told me to hold on, that we'd figure something out. We arrived back at my place. Paul offered to stay the night. I said yes. I needed someone there. We sat in the living room. I left most lights off. In the darkness, there were fewer reflections, fewer surfaces for that shape to appear, but the windows still showed the faint shine of streetlights. Sometimes I looked up and saw a black outline in the window. It felt like a silent threat. We tried to watch a comedy on TV to distract ourselves, but the screen's dark sections kept showing hints of that shape. It was standing behind the couch in the reflection, even though physically there was only empty space behind us. My skin prickled. Paul noticed it too. He turned off the TV. I felt my phone vibrating in my pocket. A notification from a random app. The screen was black except for the words, but I glimpsed the reflection again. The shape was so close I could almost feel its breath, even though it didn't have a face. My hand jerked, and I dropped the phone on the couch. That night was long. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was standing over me. Paul dozed off for a while, but I stayed awake. Whenever I heard the slightest sound, I jumped. I couldn't relax. My chest felt tight. My head was still throbbing, and I couldn't ignore the sense that the shape was getting stronger, like it was feeding off my fear. By early morning, I was exhausted. My voice was hoarse from telling Paul I was okay, from trying not to panic. We eventually talked about the shape, about how it might be trying to replace me. It moved like it wanted my spot in the mirror. We had no idea what would happen if it ever lined up perfectly with me. We didn't want to find out. I'm still here. I'm still invisible in reflections. The shape is still out there in every shiny surface. It stands off to the side, twisting around and mocking me, waiting. I don't know how much closer it can get. I don't know what else to do. I just keep hoping it doesn't find a way to push me out of my own place in the real world. Meanwhile, I avoid mirrors, windows, any surface that can show me what isn't there. Sometimes I catch myself looking over my shoulder, checking the room behind me. I'm always alone. But in the corner of my eye, I see a dark figure flickering against the shiny parts of my surroundings. Whenever that happens, my heart kicks into gear, and I feel a rush of cold fear in my stomach. It's a simple reaction, a wave of nausea and dread. My entire body goes tense, and I back away until I find a spot without any reflections. That's my new normal. I've learned to keep most lights off or very dim. I keep curtains shut. I cover up the mirrors with blankets. I stay away from anything polished. Paul visits me sometimes, but he doesn't know how to help. No doctor has an answer for this. I can't even prove it to them in a normal way because once they see me absent in the mirror, they get too stunned to respond with any real solution. They just scratch their heads or walk away. Some of them suggest I see a psychiatrist, but none of those appointments have led anywhere useful. I can't tell if the shape is getting stronger or if my mind is playing tricks on me. All I know is that it's always there, waiting. It does those distorted movements. It stares with a face that doesn't exist. It mirrors me, but not fully. It's like it's trying to learn how to be me, bit by bit. Every day I feel a little weaker, a little more anxious. My body feels real, but my reflection is gone. The shape wants it. Maybe it wants to be seen to step out of that reflective world and stand where I am. I have no idea what happens if it succeeds. Until then, I'm stuck like this. I live in partial darkness, hiding from my own missing reflection, nervous about what I might see when I accidentally catch a glimpse of any reflective surface. My life is small now, restricted. My identity feels shaky. But I'm still physically here, and I intend to stay. The shape can move and shift and creep all at once. I'm not giving it my place in the real world. If it comes closer, if it tries to reach out, I'll do whatever I have to do to push it back. For now, this is my life, and I'm not letting go.